In 480 BC, an alliance of Greek city-states led by King Leonidas, or Gerard Butler depending on who you ask, briefly stopped the Second Persian invasion of Greece in its tracks, buying enough time for Athens to be evacuated and its culture, with an impact lasting to this day, to be preserved. But what if you used the Konami cheat code in real life and brought a machine gun to history's most famous last stand? History would have you believe that Thermopylae was fought by a combined force of Greek soldiers led by Sparta's King Leonidas and 300 of his best warriors. However, the 2006 documentary film 300 clearly puts this myth to rest by exposing the truth that Thermopylae was held by just 300 Spartans using the power of their washboard abs and lots of slow-motion action. The part that historians, aka nerds who probably don't even lift, bro, did get right is that Thermopylae was specifically chosen by the Greeks because it heavily favored them militarily. The narrow pass was perfect for the Greeks' preferred way of fighting, the use of hoplites in tight, densely packed formations of hot, sweaty, well-muscled men. The phalanx, as it was called, would normally be very vulnerable to flanking attacks by cavalry, but the narrowness of the pass, however, made the use of cavalry impossible, and it somewhat negated Xerxes' advantage of superior numbers. Estimates of Persian numbers vary wildly. Ancient historians like Herodotus claim the Persian army was made up of 2.6 million soldiers with an equivalent number of support personnel. Simonides, who was actually alive at the time, claimed the Persians brought 4 million soldiers, while others claim a more modest 800,000. However, modern scholars roundly reject those figures on the basis of them being basically logistically impossible. Based on knowledge of Persian logistics, known bases of operations, and other manpower constraints, most historians place the actual number of Persians at between 120,000 and 300,000, though it's unknown if Xerxes marched with his entire force on Thermopylae or likely left garrisons behind. Whatever the real number, it was an impressive force, and it was clear that Xerxes was pretty over Greece's continual meddling in border rebellions and refusal to bend the knee. But what did the battlefield actually look like? Ancient claims state that the pass at Thermopylae was only wide enough for a single chariot to pass at the time, which would have been great for the Greeks and suicide for the Persians to attempt to force. This isn't widely accepted as a reliable description, however, and instead modern historians believe the pass at the time was actually about 100 meters wide. This would have been bad news for the defenders, but the Phocians were reported to have channeled a local stream to flood the area and create a marsh. Greek historian Pausanias noted that when a force of Gauls attempted to force the pass, their cavalry proved useless because of the smooth natural rock and the slippery, marshy ground which pulled their horses down into the mud. He recounts that Gaulish losses to the swamp and mud were significant. Along the path, though, the Greeks had built a series of fortifications meant to funnel enemy forces into narrow corridors. 100 years before the battle, the Phocians had built a large wall at the center gate to help defend from Thessalian invasions, with the name Hot Gates coming from the nearby hot springs. To make matters worse for the Persian invaders, the sea butted right up against the pass on one side, and on the other, the hilly terrain was thoroughly impassable due to the extreme weather having deformed the land and thick, thorny brush rising as high as 10 feet. The original pass is several kilometers inland today due to sedimentation, but it's still a defensive feature. In 1941, British Commonwealth troops stood against invading Nazis in the exact same spot that Leonidas and the Greeks had made their last stand. The two sides took different approaches to combat, and this was reflected in both their training and equipment. It's overwhelmingly accepted that the Greeks were the superior fighting force in equipment and training, if not numbers, and far better prepared for the battle than the Persians who faced them. Each soldier carried a large curving shield named a hoplon, which was 3 feet in diameter. These shields were made out of wood but often had a layer of bronze laid over the front to strengthen it against blows. The shield weighed a hefty 16 pounds, requiring extensive training to use it effectively without exhausting oneself in combat, something Greek hoplites did extensively. For the Spartans specifically, war was considered a vacation, as their training regimes were significantly less harsh in times of war than when at peace. The shields were curved so as to deflect incoming blows, much like modern tank armor. This would significantly reduce stress and fatigue on the user and increase the durability of the shield. An experienced combatant could also use the shield's deflective properties to put his foe at a significant disadvantage by causing their blow to deflect wildly, leaving them exposed to a counterattack. The hefty but solid shield was also designed to be used as a battering ram, with the phalanx acting in concert to batter forward into an enemy repeatedly and knock them off balance, where they could be easily finished off as the phalanx marched literally on top of their corpses. Greek soldiers deflected enemy blows with their washboard abs alone. Historians find this controversial, however, and insist each soldier would wear one of two types of body armor. The first was a bronze breastplate that covered the chest and back, and at the time would have been completely impervious to any stab wound. However, these breastplates could weigh as much as 40 pounds, quickly exhausting their wearer. Thus, many Greeks instead opted for lighter armor made of layers of linen, stiffened and glued together, a less effective but much lighter solution that didn't affect mobility. Even Spartans wore armor, with the myth of them fighting naked largely stemming from their portrayal as such in paintings and pottery, which was meant to make them more imposing and heroic figures. We have to agree, if the Ukrainian army suddenly stormed Russian lines completely buck naked, it would certainly be an imposing and heroic sight. To protect their legs, Greek hoplites would wear greaves made of bronze, which would extend from just above the knee down to the ankle. This required a very skilled blacksmith, though, and the armor was likely only available to select troops, likely the elite soldiers at the very front of the phalanx, who would be the most vulnerable. To protect their heads, they wore a helmet which covered the entire head down to the neck, and all made out of a single sheet of iron. These helmets would often have horsehair crests, both to denote rank and to make the soldier appear larger and more intimidating on the battlefield. When it comes to offense, the Greeks used a combination of sword and spear. The heavy spear would be 6 to 8 feet long with an iron blade and a bronze tip on the butt. The spear would be the primary weapon of the phalanx, holding the enemy under threat even from a distance and turning the entire formation into a prickly porcupine of death. As a backup weapon, they would have carried a double-edged short sword about 2 feet long and made of iron. Now we get to Persian equipment, which will be important once we introduce our time-traveling machine gun. The United States military spends a great deal of money studying how different environments will affect its ability to conduct military operations, or even the operation of individual pieces of equipment. The Persians made no such investment, and history tells us the result. Hailing from a hot Middle Eastern climate, the Persians could not physically fight with heavy armor, or they risked death by heat exhaustion. Persian forces also relied heavily on missile warfare, as once more intense hand-to-hand combat in the heat of the Middle East would be a torturous affair, as the crusading European powers would find out centuries later. This meant that the Persians relied heavily on the use of bows, slings, and light-throwing spears. Persian forces would rely on mobility and overwhelming ranged firepower to strike first and strike hard. The only warriors that would have had heavy armor would be the elite cavalry, which did the bulk of the hand-to-hand fighting, with the rest of the Persian force largely wearing simple tunics that reached the knees and were often padded with linen meant to protect from arrows. While later Persian forces would adopt metallic armor to a degree, this was largely due to an influx of Greek mercenaries. With arrows being the primary threat to a Persian soldier, they would use large 5-foot-tall shields made of sticks bound together with animal skins. Wicker was often also used and provided slightly more protection. Frontline soldiers would utilize these large shields to protect the archers in the back who would fire over them. Elite soldiers like cavalry or the famous Immortals fighting force could enjoy the benefit of better equipment, but that was rare. Sometimes they would utilize scale armor made of bronze or iron, which offered a significant advantage over the simple linen-padded tunics their compatriots wore to battle. The one advantage the Persians had over the Greeks was in their archers. Around 600 BC, the Persian Empire hired Scythian archers to teach them to become master archers. They adopted the Scythian design for their bows with some modifications, and while initially they eschewed the compound bow design of the Scythians, they soon adopted it given how much more powerful the bows were. Their arrows would be tipped with bronze and could be fired from just over 100 yards away, with the primary defense armaments being leather and wicker shields, and their bows firing arrows that could not hope to penetrate the shield and Greek armor. The Persians had basically brought a knife to a gunfight. And with our time-traveling machine gun squad, the allegory is real. So what difference would a machine gun have made in the Battle of Thermopylae? Could it have ended in a decisive victory for the Greeks? In this scenario, a machine gun team of modern Greek soldiers has decided to jump into a time portal and lend their firepower to their ancestors. Modern Greek soldiers are armed with a variety of machine guns, which must be a logistical nightmare, though thankfully they all use the same NATO standard ammunition. From Rheinmetall MG3 to the FN Mags and even the M60, we have a variety to pick from. But we're not interested in pea shooters, we want a real man's machine gun, one specifically designed to stop armored vehicles and whose use on enemy infantry isn't just overkill, it's basically a war crime. We're of course talking about the M2 Browning, affectionately named Ma Deuce by American servicemen. Like sharks, the M2 was perfect from creation, with little need to evolve over the nearly 100 years the weapon's been in service. Originally designed to be used on vehicles and aircraft against other vehicles and aircraft, some enterprising American soldiers said, "Yeah, but what if we also use it to turn people into pink mist?" Thus, the M2 became an infantry support weapon, proudly turning the enemies of freedom and democracy into chunks ever since. The weapon's so successful it's been used in over 25 conflicts, most recently helping teach Russia the gravity of its error on the fields of eastern Ukraine. The weapon is belt-fed, recoil-operated, and air-cooled. It's even capable of single-shot fire when you want to tell the enemy how much they've fucked up on an individual one-by-one basis. The weapon is basically a war crime when used on infantry and has no problem taking out lightly armored vehicles, low-flying aircraft, small boats, and any dinosaur to have ever existed. New quick-change barrels and fixed headspace and timing improvements make the weapon even more effective and easier to operate by eliminating the need to manually adjust headspace and timing, and allows for rapid barrel changes. New versions of the weapon also have a flash hider that reduces muzzle flash by 95%, basically turning it into a stealth machine gun at night. Well, a really loud, stealthy machine gun. At a rate of 450 to 600 war crimes per minute, the M2 can put out a steady stream of atrocities that can devastate an infantry assault or convince the enemy to keep their heads down, effectively suppressing them. This much firepower comes with range too, with the M2 able to reach out and, as per my last email, an enemy up to 1,830 meters away. With various ammunition types, the M2 can fire a rainbow of pain, with the most common being the standard ball round to turn people into chunks, and against light material targets, tracers mixed in with regular ammunition to help a gunner more accurately turn people into chunks, armor piercing for turning people inside armored vehicles into chunks, and incendiary for turning people into fiery chunks, because why not? The M2's biggest weakness is its need to change barrels often due to the heat generated by rounds passing through the barrel at very high speed, a common problem for machine guns. However, modern engineering allows an M2 to fire for as much as several minutes before needing a barrel change, and the machine gun team is always equipped with multiple barrels for just such an occasion. Just how long a barrel lasts depends on a variety of factors, including weather, rate of fire, and just which is more likely to kill you first, the enemy or a disastrous barrel failure causing a rupture. So, how is our Persian force going to stand up to a modern Greek machine gun team equipped with the old Ma Deuce? In the real Battle of Thermopylae, the Persian forces began their assault by peppering the Greeks with a volley of arrows, fired from just over 100 meters away. This had little to no effect on the heavily armored Greeks, who were at best mildly annoyed by the attack. This is Persian fighting doctrine though, as typically most battles would have been won or at least decisively impacted by a large volley of long-range fire. Today, the Persian force is simply following protocol as it moves to assault the Greek position. However, what some in the front row might begin to spot is a strange turn of events. The Greek phalanx is several meters behind a team of 3 soldiers who appear to be operating a strange machine. Or maybe they don't spot this at all, because as mentioned, the M2 can reach out to over 1,800 meters, and there's little reason to not start to open up around that range. What's bearing down on our machine gun team is a gunner's dream. A massed formation of enemy infantry literally standing shoulder to shoulder on a narrow advance. There's no room to move anywhere but forward, and despite a maximum point target range of 1,500 meters, the whole advancing Persian force is basically an area target, and in this environment, accuracy is a non-concern. The only reason to wait to open up is to encourage the Persian forces to move closer, because in all likelihood, the moment the M2 starts going, the Persian force is going to break and run. So our gunner decides he's not going to engage until the Persians are within 500 meters. Now this is a bit risky. There's about 100,000 of the enemy and a significant number of them are advancing. Once they're within 120 meters or so, they'll be able to employ their bows with great accuracy and effectiveness. And while modern body armor and helmets are more than a match for ancient arrows, the legs and arms are woefully exposed. We consulted with medical professionals and they unanimously agreed arrows in the limbs are best avoided at all costs, especially to the knee. To make matters worse, the M2 weighs about 84 pounds. Add in the tripod and other equipment and you're pushing well over 100 pounds, so our machine gunners aren't going to be beating a hasty retreat if things get hairy. But they probably won't need to, because the moment the enemy gets within 500 meters, a literal act of God descends upon their front lines. As a reminder, the front lines of the Persian assault are equipped with light leather shields, more suited for stopping lightweight arrows than even heavy Greek spears. With cavalry out of the question, there is a possibility that the front Persian lines may consist of soldiers in bronze or even iron scale armor, though it's more likely they're wearing the linen-reinforced tunics they would have worn in their desert climate. There is no United Nations or Geneva Convention in 480 BC, and that's a good thing, because what happens next is a crime against humanity. This writer has seen the effects of 50 caliber fire on unarmored human bodies, and the effects are uncomfortable. The entire front line of the Persian force is suddenly going to experience a personal, rapid physical disassembly event as the 50 caliber fire turns chests into pudding and amputates entire limbs off. However, the heavy rounds are packing a whopping 12,558 foot-pounds of force, which means they don't stop when they strike the first Persian line. They'll continue on to the second, each bullet's trajectory affected by the bone and muscle it chews its way through and deflected off course. In testing, a 50 caliber round fired from a Barrett M107 rifle pushed through 32 inches of ballistic gelatin. An M2 can shoot straight through even a 2-foot diameter tree or half a foot of concrete, as many jihadists found out during US operations in the Middle East. What we're saying is each round is likely going to score 3 kills in this tightly packed environment, with anyone in the 3rd or 4th row who survives desperately wishing they had not. The roar of the M2 as it fires is something to consider all on its own. Ancient Persians would have never heard anything like it. The best they might be able to approximate it to was a constant volcanic explosion, except they probably never heard that either. The psychological impact of the roar of a Madus alone is likely enough to cause the Persian army to break in panic, followed by the absolute decimation of rank after rank of soldier. The staggering amount of death and the swiftness and brutality with which it is delivered is also another psychological factor to consider. The ancient mind would have no basis for such an event. You may have never served in combat yourself, but you're aware of what a heavy machine gun could do to people. For the ancients, this would literally be a supernatural event of unprecedented brutality. The biggest limiting factor the M2 team is going to have is the amount of ammunition they bring with them, likely only 2,000 rounds or so, given the big 50 caliber ammo is quite heavy. This isn't enough to destroy a force of 100,000, but it doesn't need to be. Just a few hundred rounds and the casualties it causes will likely lead to the total collapse of the front half of Xerxes' army. The staggeringly loud roar of the M2 would be clearly audible even to support personnel miles away from the front. Stories from the few who survived the front line would spread like wildfire, and while maybe Xerxes could manage to rally a second attack, not a single survivor of the first would be likely to be included in that number. After repelling the second attack in a similarly brutal fashion, Xerxes' army would psychologically crumble, its morale destroyed, and inevitably flee Greece with tales of the supernatural horrors of the Greek employ. The battle would be a complete rout, and it wouldn't even be casualties which would be the deciding factor. It would be sheer psychological terror of what the weapon can do to an ancient army. Even in modern combat, soldiers have broken under intense machine gun fire. To the unprepared ancient mind, such an experience would likely have permanent and profound psychological effects. Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors are surrounded by Persian forces. The Spartans deflect blow after blow with their shields as enemy soldiers crash against them like a wave in a storm. Spears shoot out of the Spartan line like lightning, tearing through enemy flesh, but they are vastly outnumbered. Many began to fall. Shields are splintered, spears broken in two. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans retreat up a hill to make their final stand. Suddenly, an arrow enters the chest of the great king. Leonidas falls to the ground as his blood soaks into the earth around him. The Battle of Thermopylae went down in history as one of the most awe-inspiring fights of all time. But how much of what we see on the big screen and TV is actually true? Not everything you've watched or read about the Battle of Thermopylae is correct, but some truths are even more incredible than the dramatizations of Hollywood. The invasion of Greece by the Persians was predicated on revenge more than anything else. Xerxes, the ruler of the Persian Empire, had lived with the brutal defeat of his father's forces by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. His father was Darius, king of everything, and everyone from Egypt to West India, but he never managed to conquer the Greeks. The inability to defeat the Greeks was both a devastating blow and a humiliating blunder for the ruling family of Persia. Xerxes was determined to crush the insolence of the Greeks once and for all. 10 years after the failed invasion of Greece by Darius, Xerxes would launch his own campaign into the heart of the country to the west. This time, however, the Spartans of legend would join the battle. There would be so much bloodshed and destruction during the Battle of Thermopylae that the final stand of the 300 would never be forgotten. In 480 BCE, Xerxes and his forces began marching toward the center of Greece toward Athens. At the time, many Greek city-states were warring with one another. But when Athens received word of their impending doom at the hands of the Persians, they pleaded with the other Greek city-states to form an army to stop the invasion force. The Athenians had been able to fend off Darius and his forces in the past, but Xerxes commanded an army many times larger than his father. Surprisingly, Sparta answered Athens' plea for help. Up until that point, Sparta had stayed out of conflicts with Persia, but the leaders of the great city-states saw this new threat to their people and land as too great to ignore and decided the Persians must be stopped at all costs. From scouting missions and allies to the east, the Greeks received word that Xerxes' army was enormous. It was estimated that he commanded somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 men. This military force would be much harder to defeat than the one Darius had brought with him a decade earlier. If the Greeks were not prepared, this would spell the end of democracy and their very way of life. Sparta knew that the only way Greece would be able to survive this invasion would be if they could gather soldiers from across the city-states together, but this would take time. It was decided that the only possibility for success would be if Xerxes' forces could be slowed down, giving Greece more time to organize their defenses. Scouts were sent across the lands of Greece to find a location to make a stand, some place where the number of soldiers Xerxes had wouldn't matter. Tensions were high as some Greek city-states refused to join the cause, while others blatantly backed the Persian forces and welcomed their new overlords. But Sparta and Athens would not let the progress they'd made and the freedoms their people enjoyed be taken away by a foreign power. The scouts eventually returned with a location that suited their needs. There was a narrow pass at Thermopylae that the Persian army would need to pass through to get from northern Greece into the center where Athens and Sparta were located. Thermopylae also sat near waterways that connected mainland Greece to the Aegean Sea, which meant Athens' formidable navy would be able to hold off Persian ships and prevent any forces from landing on the shores behind Thermopylae. This would stop the Persians from circling behind the Greek forces deployed at the narrow pass, making sure the only way into central Greece was by land. It was the best possible location for a defense, and the Greeks' only hope for slowing down the swarm of Persian soldiers approaching their lands. However, this location was literally the spitting image of hell. The location was named Thermopylae, which translates to hot gates, because the landscape was filled with hot sulfur springs. This created an eerie mist that covered parts of the battlefield and a terrible smell. A more ominous location could not have been chosen even if they'd tried. The Greeks' plan to slow Xerxes now had its foundation, but there was a problem. Xerxes was already close, and there wasn't enough time to send all of the Greek armies to Thermopylae. In fact, many city-states still didn't think there was an invasion force coming at all. It also didn't help that the Olympics and several important religious festivals were happening at the end of the summer, which would be at the same time that Xerxes' forces would reach the hot gates. Many city-states were so focused on these other events that they couldn't be bothered by something as trivial as a massive invasion force knocking on their front door. Sparta decided they couldn't wait for the rest of Greece to come to their senses. They needed to send a force to secure the hot gates and give the rest of the city-states time to organize their militaries. After weighing their options, Sparta determined that they needed to send one of their 2 kings and a force of 300 elite soldiers to Thermopylae to hold the hot gates as long as possible. The king chosen for this mission was Leonidas, but before he could head out, Sparta needed to speak with the oracle at Delphi. This was not an uncommon occurrence. The oracle needed to be consulted before going to war and making major decisions. However, when the oracle looked into the future, they had bad news for the Spartans. The oracle foretold that the Persians would destroy either Sparta as a whole or one of the kings of Sparta would need to die. When this prophecy reached Leonidas, he did not hesitate for a moment. He would gladly lay down his own life if it meant securing victory for Sparta. Now that the oracle had been consulted, Leonidas needed to select his 300 soldiers and head to Thermopylae to prepare for battle. It seems likely that Leonidas knew that he and his forces would not be making it back alive, as he only chose men who had already had a male heir to carry on their family lineage. Spartan warriors fought until victory or death, and since they were so outnumbered and the main objective was to slow Xerxes down as much as possible, no one was coming home. Also, Leonidas had the oracle's prophecy to contend with. Unless he somehow managed to defeat 100,000 men with his 300 Spartans and a handful of other Greek soldiers, he would need to fight to the death in order to ensure the prophecy was fulfilled and Sparta itself did not fall. Sparta recruited as many other soldiers as possible for the mission from their allies and the surrounding area. The Athenians were in charge of protecting the seas, so they could only offer a limited number of soldiers upon land. Upon departure for Thermopylae, Leonidas had his army of 300 Spartan soldiers and around 7,000 other men made up of Athenians, 1,000 Phocians, 700 Thespians, and 400 Thebans. The force marched from central Greece to Thermopylae. The stage was set for the greatest battle in ancient history. In late July or early August of 480 BCE, Leonidas and his forces reached the Hot Gates and set up their defenses. They were a few days ahead of the Persians, which gave them time to scout out the area and make sure everyone knew what to do during battle. The Spartans were hardened warriors who had fought in wars before. However, the same could not be said about all the soldiers that made up the rest of Leonidas' resistance force. The pass through the Hot Gates was approximately 20 to 100 meters across. On one side was a sheer cliff that dropped into a sea below. On the other were impenetrable, jagged mountains. With his 300 Spartans at the front and in key positions along the opening of the pass, Leonidas could fend off the oncoming Persian forces. The narrowness of the Hot Gates rendered the number advantage that Xerxes had over the Greeks almost completely useless and would mean that his cavalry wouldn't be able to outflank Greek forces. But would this be enough to allow Leonidas and his men to slow the Persian army? Only time would tell. Up until this point, Xerxes and his military had met little resistance. They had marched across the Persian Empire, crossed the Dardanelles Strait on 2 pontoon bridges, and made their way through northern Greece to Thermopylae. As Leonidas waited for the Persian army to reach the Hot Gates, he sent men out to scout the area. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. The Spartans and their allies were eating and preparing themselves for battle when one of the scouts frantically returned to the camp. He had terrible news. A hidden path in the mountains led from where the Persians would be camped to behind the Greek line. If the Persians discovered the trail, they'd be able to surround the Greeks and massacre them. Leonidas didn't have enough men to fend off attacks from both the front and the back of his resistance force. Leonidas sent 1,000 Phocians to guard the path in case the Persians discovered it. When Xerxes and his forces finally arrived at Thermopylae, they decided to wait 4 days before commencing their attack. One reason for this was to give the Persian troops time to rest, but Xerxes also had something else in mind. He was almost positive that when the Greeks saw the size of his army, they'd run away in fear. Much to the dismay of Xerxes, this did not happen. The Spartans had no intention of giving up Thermopylae and letting the Persians pass without a fight. After waiting a few days to see if the Greeks would just give up, Xerxes sent an envoy to ask Leonidas to lay down his arms. According to the philosopher Plutarch, Leonidas' response was, "Come and take them." Xerxes did not receive this defiance very well and decided it was time to prepare for battle. Before launching his first attacks, he sent scouts to see how the Spartans were doing in preparation for battle. Their report shocked the Persian king. The scouts had found the Spartans exercising naked and grooming each other's hair. The reason for this likely had to do with the religious and funerary beliefs of the Spartans. Since Spartan soldiers fought until they were victorious or dead, they needed to ensure their bodies were prepared for the afterlife. Therefore, before a battle, they would groom each other. Another little-known fact about the way Spartans looked was that all Spartan men shaved their upper lip. Like most Greek men, they still let their beards grow long, but the upper lip was always shaved. 5 days after arriving in Thermopylae, Xerxes ordered his troops forward. He was sure that the superior numbers would make quick work of the small Greek force, so he initially sent only his most mediocre soldiers into battle. Xerxes quickly found out that this was a huge mistake. The Spartans' fighting ability was unmatched by any other soldiers in the field. The Greeks had been practicing their tactics on the rough terrain of Thermopylae for several days, which also gave them a slight advantage. They used a phalanx formation, which was extremely effective in the tight spaces of the Hot Gates, and the Greek warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder, forming a wall of shields in front of them. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers crashed against the Greek line, but it did not break. The phalanx was so successful because the Greek shields were stronger than the Persian weapons, and their spears provided a further reach. The Persians were using short javelins and wicker shields. These definitely provided them an advantage in open field combat as they offered more mobility, but in the tight quarters of Thermopylae, these weapons were just not as effective against the heavily armed Spartans. It seemed that no matter what they did, the Persians couldn't get past the front line of the Greeks. Leonidas and his Spartans were fierce. They would patiently wait for a buildup of Persian soldiers against their shields and then use their spears from further back to decimate any enemy who left themselves vulnerable to attack. Imagine being a Persian soldier and watching line after line of your comrades die at the hands of Spartan warriors. Each wave of attack brings you closer to the deadly phalanx. You find yourself face to face with Greek shields. At your feet are the dead bodies of your friends. You look up and lock eyes with Leonidas as his spear rockets out from behind the phalanx and through your heart. It's no wonder that many Persian soldiers turned and fled the battlefield after witnessing the carnage that the Spartans unleashed. After hours of battling, the ground was soaked in Persian blood while the Greeks sustained minor casualties. Xerxes realized he needed to try a different tactic and ordered his archers to release a barrage of arrows at the Spartan forces. Unfortunately for the Persians, their arrows were about as effective as their soldiers were against the Greek shields and armor, which is to say they had little to no effect at all. For 2 days, everything went according to plan for Leonidas and his army. Even Xerxes' most elite fighters, the Immortals, couldn't defeat the Spartans and their allies. This group of soldiers got its name from the ability to immediately replace casualties, making it seem that their numbers never diminished. However, the Greeks' luck was about to change. It was said that during the first 2 days of battle, the Spartans and other Greek forces killed over 10,000 Persian soldiers. They sustained some of their own casualties, but most of the Greek force was still strong and could continue fighting indefinitely. Xerxes watched the battle from his golden throne atop a nearby hill. He became so enraged at the defeat of his soldiers, he jumped up from his seat and screamed in anger. This was unbecoming for a ruler who was seen as a god by his followers. Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors and the other Greek soldiers had done the impossible. They'd stopped the Persian war machine in its tracks. During the second day of the Battle of Thermopylae, a local Greek shepherd by the name of Ephialtes asked for an audience with Xerxes. He told the guards he had information that would allow the Persians to defeat the Spartans. At this point, Xerxes had lost all patience. It seemed that the wall of Greek soldiers would not be broken. He was ready to try anything. Ephialtes eventually got his meeting with Xerxes, and in exchange for a huge sum of money, he told the Persian emperor of the Anopaia path that went through the mountains and ended up behind the Greek defensive line. Xerxes dispatched his Immortals to encircle Leonidas and his forces. By cover of night, they left the Persian camp and traveled through the mountains. When the Immortals reached the 1,000 Phocians Leonidas had ordered to guard the mountain pass, they quickly defeated them. Some accounts say the Phocians didn't even put up a fight but ran away in fear as they spotted the enemy soldiers. Either way, the Persians were coming. Luckily, word reached Leonidas before the enemy forces did. The Spartan king ordered his men and the rest of the Greek forces to retreat further south to make their final stand. But before the battle would take place, Leonidas did something that would secure his name in the history books forever. Leonidas decided that all of the Greek soldiers could leave the battle and return home to fight another day. However, he and his 300 Spartans would stay and hold off the Persians as long as possible, taking as many with them before they were killed. Along with the Spartans, a group of Thebans would also stay and fight, but the remaining soldiers were to be sent back to their cities to tell the tale of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans who defied a Persian king and slaughtered thousands of his men. It would seem that Leonidas would indeed fulfill the prophecy of the oracle. As the sun rose on the third day of the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas gathered his men. They all knew what was to come, and they were happy to die for their king and for Sparta. Leonidas looked at each of them in turn before the day got underway, at which point he said, "Have a hearty breakfast, for tonight we dine in Hades." Later that night, the Immortals arrived from the mountain pass, and a huge force of Persian soldiers advanced through the hot gates toward the Spartans. There are two different accounts of what happened next in the epic tale of Leonidas and his 300 warriors. Ephorus and Diodorus Siculus say that like a dangerous beast trapped in a corner, Leonidas decided to do something unpredictable and attack first. In this scenario, the Spartans charged into the Persian camp and slaughtered a large number of soldiers before being pushed back. The other account by Herodotus states that the Persians struck first, but not before Xerxes presented an offering to the gods for his generals before launching the final attack that would wipe out the Spartans. Either way, the outcome of what came next was the same. Leonidas and his men repositioned themselves in an open area where they'd be able to move around better and kill as many Persian soldiers as possible. As the Immortals closed in on one side and the rest of Xerxes' forces moved in on the other, the Spartans began fighting in a frenzied manner. They did not forget their training, but used every method at their disposal to rip through the Persians. As their spears broke off inside of enemy soldiers and their shields shattered from slamming into the bodies of the Immortals, the Spartans drew their swords and began to slash their way through the Persian ranks. It was a bloodbath, but there were just too many Persians. Less than 300 Spartans and a handful of other Greek soldiers remained against the might of the entire Persian army. Xerxes still had tens of thousands of soldiers at his disposal, while there was no hope for reinforcements or relief from the Greeks. During the carnage, Leonidas fell. His men surrounded their king and fought off the hordes of enemy soldiers. They managed to grab Leonidas and pull his body to safety until he passed away from the wounds. At the time of the Battle of Thermopylae, Leonidas was somewhere between 50 and 60 years old. He was by no means a young man, but Spartan warriors started their training as teenagers and would serve in the military until their 60s, so it's not surprising that Leonidas was still fighting at this age. The fact that he killed so many enemies while also commanding a Greek troop at the Battle of Thermopylae makes him one of the most respected warriors of all time. Even after Leonidas fell, the Spartans that remained continued to fight. They had fallen back to higher ground and used a protective wall to slow the onslaught of enemy troops. Many of them had lost their swords, shields, and spears, so they fought with their bare hands. an unarmed Spartan warrior was still a deadly adversary. The Persians knew this, and even after breaking down the Spartan protective wall and seeing that many of them were unarmed, they did not advance. The Persian soldiers could see in the eyes of the Spartans that if they got too close, they would very likely lose their lives. So the Persians took the easy way out. Rather than trying to defeat the Spartans in hand-to-hand combat, they used bows and arrows to kill the remaining warriors. This may seem like a cowardly thing to do, but after witnessing how much damage and death the Spartans had caused over the last 3 days, they probably wanted to stay as far away from them as possible. A barrage of arrows was fired into the remaining Spartans, killing them all. Now that the defiant Spartans had been defeated, Xerxes could move freely across the battlefield without fear of being killed. He did not fight alongside his soldiers like Leonidas did. Once the Battle of Thermopylae ended, Xerxes had Leonidas' head cut off and his body impaled on a stake. After Xerxes and his forces moved on, Greek citizens recovered the bodies of the dead soldiers, including Leonidas, and buried them at Thermopylae. After the Persian War ended, a stone monument in the shape of a lion was erected on the spot where the 300 Spartans were buried. On it, the words, "Go tell the Spartans, thou that passest by, that here obedient to their words we lie," were written by the poet Simonides. Basically, he was saying that the 300 Spartans who said they would fight to the death to slow the advance of the Persian army were true to their word. Now, to be fair, several Spartan soldiers died in the battle before the final stand. Also, King Leonidas allowed 2 Spartans who were ill to return home instead of forcing them to fight in the final battle. One refused to leave and was killed with the rest, while the other, a man named Aristodemus, did return home to Sparta. However, once he reached the city, he instantly regretted his decision. From the moment Aristodemus stepped foot in Sparta, he was shunned by everyone in the city. The fact that he had abandoned his duty and left his king to die on the battlefield was unforgivable. Aristodemus was stripped of his civic rights and had to carry his disgrace as a coward for the rest of his life. Luckily for Aristodemus, that wouldn't be very long. The next year, he joined a campaign to fight the Persians once again at the Battle of Plataea. It was said Aristodemus fought like a madman as he wanted to make up for his shameful decision to leave the Battle of Thermopylae. He ran to the front lines in a rage-filled fury and slashed apart the Persian ranks until he was finally brought down and killed. There is no doubt that Leonidas, his 300 Spartans, and other Greek soldiers who fought at the Battle of Thermopylae slowed down the Persian advance through Greece. But there was a much more important effect that the battle had on the Greek populace. After the story of the 300 spread across the lands of Greece, more and more people felt it was their duty to fight. This was a matter of pride for many, and a way to avenge the deaths of the 300 Spartans who had fallen at the Battle of Thermopylae. It was also clear at this point that the Persians were coming for everyone, and all men who could fight needed to do so. The Spartans stopped the Persian forces at the Hot Gates for several days and did significant damage to their ranks and morale. The Persian soldiers who fought against Leonidas and his 300 Spartans would not soon forget how vicious and deadly they were. As Xerxes' armies marched into Greece, they were met by an even larger Spartan force, which must have been incredibly intimidating. The victories at Salamis and Plataea led to the Greeks finally defeating the invading Persian force and pushing them out of their borders. The sacrifice made by the men at the Battle of Thermopylae was definitely a call to arms for many Greeks. Without it, the Persians may very well have conquered the rest of Greece and enveloped it into their empire. Around 440 BCE, decades after the Persian Wars were over, the bones of Leonidas were dug up and brought back to Sparta. His tomb still exists where the modern city of Sparta is today. Western democracy traces its roots to ancient Greece, a land of squabbling city-states. Amongst these warring city-states arose Athens, a group of men who had a funny idea. Citizens should get a say in who exactly got to rule them. Though initially imperfect in its implementation, that idea has since evolved to the free democratic nations most of us live in today. But it could all have been lost to a single moment in history. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today, we're taking a look at another of the great battles in history, the Battle of Thermopylae. In 499 BC, Greek cities which had been captured by the Persians in Asia Minor revolted against the brutal tyrants that had been placed to oversee them. In support of their conquered brethren, Athens and Eretria sent troops. Despite some major gains, several strategic mistakes cost the Greeks of Asia Minor their ultimate victory, and the rebellion was put down. With Asia Minor back in the fold of the Persian Empire, the Persian king Darius I vowed to punish Athens and Eretria for their involvement, and saw the rest of the free cities of Greece as a threat to his empire. In 492 BC, he launched an invasion of Thrace and Macedon, then sent heralds to the remaining Greek city-states, demanding they accept Persian rule. Seeking to save themselves, many agreed, with the notable exceptions of Athens and Sparta. The Persian heralds in Athens were thrown into a pit, and their Spartan brethren followed suit by tossing theirs into a well. Enraged, Darius launched his invasion of mainland Greece and met with further success until an encounter against 10,000 Athenians in Marathon. Outnumbering the Greeks 2.5 to 1, Darius saw an easy win, only for the Athenians to achieve a dramatic victory and force Darius to retreat. Nursing a very wounded ego, Darius planned an imminent reinvasion with plans to raze Athens to the ground. But internal politics delayed these plans and Darius died of old age. Seeking to avenge the pride of his dead father, Xerxes prepared for a decisive campaign to end Greek independence forever. Remembering well the lessons at Marathon, Xerxes took his time to build a sizable force. Though some historical accounts tell of a force of up to 2.5 million strong, these are almost certainly gross exaggerations, and it's more likely that Xerxes marched with 200,000 to 250,000. Though for the ancient world this would certainly have been an incredible and mind-boggling number. Xerxes' plan was simple: march into Greece through the north and outflank any Greek defenders by landing his navy behind them along the Greek coast. Many Greeks feared Xerxes' invasion force and remembered well the fate of Eretria in the first invasion, which was razed to the ground and all of its people enslaved. Thus, many Greek cities bid for peace, but Athens and Sparta, along with some key allies, would hear nothing of it. Spartan King Leonidas marshaled a force of 300 of his personal bodyguards and helots and took command of the briefly unified Greek forces numbering at 7,000. Despite the way the battle was popularized by popular culture and entertainment such as the film 300, the bulk of the Spartan army did not march in support of its king because the Spartans greatly feared that the helots they held as slaves might break into an all-out revolt if the army left, and didn't take them with them. Knowing victory would be impossible if the Persian forces simply outflanked them by sea, Athens marshaled a force of 271 triremes to sail into battle against 1,207 Persian ships. Outnumbered both on land and at sea, the Greeks stood little chance of victory. A collapse of the Spartan position at Thermopylae would allow the fleet to be flanked, and a defeat at sea would place the ground defense in jeopardy. Outnumbered by incredible ratios, victory was unlikely, a fact Athens knew well as it had already begun the evacuation of the city. The combatants. The Persian army at the time was equipped for battle on the plains of Asia, and as such, wore mostly leather and cloth armor and shields made of wicker. They carried short spears and wielded large daggers and swords. Most notably, the Persians, likely accustomed to fighting less well-armored opponents than the Greeks, made extensive use of archers, which was part of the reason of their defeat at Marathon. The lightly armored Persian archers could not penetrate the armor of the Athenian forces, and when close to melee range were made short work of. Leading the Persian troops was a force of 10,000 immortals, a cadre of elite soldiers famed for always maintaining a standing force of exactly 10,000. Hence the name Immortals. When any member was killed, wounded, or became sick, they were immediately replaced, thus leaving the Immortals a cohesive unit through any conflict. The Immortals were Persia's elite heavy infantry and often served as guards to the god kings themselves. At sea, the Persians fielded the warship of the day, the trireme. Powered by a combination of sails and oars, triremes were equipped with a bronze-sheathed battering ram, which it used to ram enemy vessels. However, it's unlikely that these violent crashes would actually sink an enemy ship, and most of the fighting was done in hand-to-hand combat by the marines and slaves who manned the ships. Formidable for their time, triremes were also notoriously poor seagoing vessels and had to stick close to shore and operate only during relatively calm seas. A series of storms prior to the battle would see nearly a third of the Persian fleet sunk, severely lowering their naval power. To complicate matters, a great deal of the Persian fleet was also made of supply and support vessels, not dedicated warships, as opposed to the military vessels and crews of the Athenians and their allies. Greek ground forces were far better equipped for combat than their Persian counterparts. A Greek hoplite's primary weapon was a 2 to 3 meter spear with a leaf-shaped blade at one end and a short spike at the other. This allowed Greek troops to fight in the famed phalanx formation and presented any would-be attackers with a unified front of long spears to contend with. Armed as they were with shorter spears and swords, the Persians found this difficult to overcome. Greek infantry was also equipped with large bronze-layered shields called hoplons, which offered unparalleled protection versus the wicker shield in use by the Persians. On their bodies, Greek soldiers wore heavy bronze breastplates, bronze greaves, and helmets also made of bronze. The use of bronze in heavy armor would prove to be a decisive advantage for the Greeks. At sea, the mostly Athenian fleet was also equipped with a trireme. However, unlike the Persian forces, nearly all of the Greek ships were military vessels. Having become rich from their silver mines, the Athenians had decided to invest heavily into a formidable fleet, which in turn made them undisputed masters of the Aegean. The battle. As Persian forces marched into Greece, Leonidas led his small army for the pass at Thermopylae, which at the time was no more than 50 feet across and bordered on one side by tall cliffs and the ocean on the other. The pass allowed Greek forces to make the best use of their formidable phalanx formation, while completely denying the Persians the advantage of their overwhelming numbers. Massing his forces before the Greek position, Xerxes dispatched a spy to ascertain what the Greeks were up to, only for the astonished spy to return and report that the Greeks were stripping nude for exercise and fixing each other's hair, a common tradition especially among the Spartans. Sending a formal messenger, Xerxes offered the assembled Greeks a truce. The defenders should surrender and become allies to Xerxes in exchange for being allowed to retreat unharmed and being granted some of the lands of those who resisted. The offer was debated amongst the assembled Greeks, with many wanting to accept it, including a number of Spartans. But in the end, it was Leonidas' leadership that kept the alliance together. Infuriated by the rejection, Xerxes ordered his troops forward into battle. Funneled into the narrow pass, the Persian forces ran into the shields and spears of the Greek defenders, not making so much as a dent. Armed with short spears and swords, Persian forces could not penetrate the layers of the Greek phalanx, and thousands died while the Greeks suffered few losses. Enraged, Xerxes ordered his infamous immortals into the fray, confident of their victory. Yet even the immortals met with the same fate: death on the spear points and shields of the Greek phalanx. Meanwhile at sea, a storm had scattered and decimated the Persian fleet, allowing the smaller and much more mobile Greek fleet to target small scattered groups of Persian ships and destroy them. On the first day alone, the Greeks captured 30 ships and destroyed many more. And on the second day of the battle, the Greek navy completely destroyed the flotilla of the Cilicians, a vassal of the Persian Empire. Despite all odds, it seemed victory may have just been possible. Yet, at the night of the second day, fate turned against the Greek defenders, or perhaps the inevitability of facing off against such overwhelming numbers. Though legend states that a Greek defector known as Ephialtes contacted Xerxes and offered to show the Persians a route around the Greek position, in all likelihood it was simply a matter of time that Persian scouts discovered the hidden path. Knowing the secret of the path, Leonidas stationed a force of 100 to defend it. But caught by surprise, the defenders were quickly scattered by advancing Persian forces. Receiving news of imminent encirclement, Leonidas considered his options and chose to order the majority of his forces to retreat, while making one last stand against the advancing Persians. Death was certain, and history has long debated why Leonidas chose to stay and fight. Some accounts state that an oracle had declared that Sparta would only be saved by the death of one of its kings, and thus Leonidas was prompted by prophecy. However, in all likelihood, Leonidas chose to stay and fight as a matter of sheer military necessity. Without a rear guard to protect the Greek retreat, retreating forces would be decimated by the advancing Persians. Prudent, but given the character of Leonidas and his agreement to ally with Athens and other former enemies, it's also likely that Leonidas' choice was based on some level of idealism as well. For centuries, Greece had been divided, and in fact, many historians agree that if Greece had ever unified and remained unified, it could have conquered the ancient world and then resisted the future advances of the Macedonians and Romans. Sadly though, Greece remained a fractured land of warring city-states, and only in this time of great need had the bitterest of rivals allied together for their shared defense. If Leonidas could ensure the retreat of a unified Greek force and then make one last valiant stand against these foreign invaders, perhaps his sacrifice could rally the rest of Greece and show them they were capable of standing side by side as free Greeks, not enemies. Holding his ground with his remaining Spartans, a force of Thespians and Thebans, the Greeks reformed into a compact phalanx, with the exception of the Thebans, who surrendered to Xerxes without a fight. Flanked on both sides, a final battle raged with terrible violence, and yet despite being outnumbered, superior Greek training and equipment took a heavy toll on the Persians. Leonidas was eventually killed, though his surviving Spartans viciously fought back Persian forces 4 times to retrieve his body. Eventually, even these Spartans were overcome, and Leonidas's body was crucified, his head placed on a stake to serve as a warning against further insurrection. At sea, the battle also took a turn for the worst. Despite 2 days of stunning successes, Persian naval forces regrouped on the 3rd day and won a decisive victory against the Greek fleet. Knowing that the battle at Thermopylae had been lost, Greek forces retreated to assist in the final evacuation of Athens. The Battle of Thermopylae would come to be known as a Pyrrhic victory, or a victory where the cost is so high that it can hardly be considered a victory at all. Xerxes had his revenge against Athens, yet as his troops arrived in the city, it had already been evacuated of all but the most stubborn of elders. Razing the city to the ground, Athens was nevertheless preserved in spirit, as its population had already fled. Though the ground battle at Thermopylae is the engagement that history remembers best, it was actually the battle waged by the mostly Athenian fleets at Artemisium that would inevitably lead to the defeat of the Persian forces. A minor military victory at the time, the battles at Artemisium nevertheless gave Greek forces an insight into how the Persian fleet operated and allowed them to devise plans to defeat them in future battles. It also weakened the Persian fleet. Losses which, combined with those suffered at sea during freak storms that preceded the battle, were hard to replace. Despite their recent defeat, the Athenian general Themistocles persuaded the Greek allies into one decisive engagement against the Persians. Knowing that if they could be defeated at sea, Xerxes' ground forces would be forced to retreat as well. Lured into the narrow straits of Salamis by a cunning ploy on Themistocles' behalf, the Persian fleet bottled up and, unable to maneuver, was handily defeated. With supply lines cut off and his navy decimated, Xerxes retreated to Asia with most of his army but left a sizable portion to continue the conquest of Greece. 1 year later, though, a unified Greek force engaged the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea and secured a decisive victory, effectively ending the Persian threat to the Greek mainland. The importance of Thermopylae was manifold for the Greek people, yet of greatest import may perhaps have been the evacuation of the Athenian people, bought and paid for by the blood of the brave men who defended that narrow pass for 3 days. This preserved Athenian culture, and with so many of our modern values tracing their roots to ancient Greece, who can know what our world might look like today had Athens been eradicated as planned? Though perhaps we would have barely noticed the difference. Demonized as they have been in popular media by films such as 300, the Persians actually made many contributions to the development of democracy and were a fairly progressive people. In the end, the failed conquest of Greece and the great sacrifices at the Battle of Thermopylae may have all been for nothing more significant than the failed ambitions of human ego.
For hundreds of years, the Spartans were the most feared warriors in all of Greece. Spartan children were trained to be deadly at the age of 7. The kings went into battle alongside their warriors, and no one could stop their conquest of Greece once it began. But nothing lasts forever, not even Sparta. What happened to this great civilization? It turns out their greatest strength actually ended up being their downfall. Legend has it that the founder of Sparta was a son of Zeus named Lacedaemon. However, if we go by historical and archaeological evidence, Sparta was founded around 1000 BCE by an unknown ruler who led a group of tribes belonging to the Dorian ethnicity to the region. However, there might also be a connection between the founding of Sparta and King Menelaus from the Trojan War epic. We do not know exactly who founded Sparta, but whoever it was created one of the most powerful warrior civilizations the world has ever seen. The city of Sparta grew in size and became very powerful very quickly. 2 kings ruled the city-state at any given time, and its society focused on warfare and dedication to the state. Upon being born into Spartan society, a baby would be examined by a council of elders. They would look for any defects in the child, and if they were seen as unfit, the infant would be abandoned on a nearby hilltop. Some legends say that any unhealthy babies were thrown from the top of Mount Taygetus into a pit below. However, recent research suggests that the Spartans might have been more compassionate and raised their babies even if they were not perfect. But if a child did have a disability, it's unlikely they would have been able to complete the rigorous training regimen that every Spartan boy had to go through at the age of 7. It was this military education program known as the Agoge that set Spartan warriors apart from the rest of Greece. Spartan children were voluntarily surrendered to the state by their parents, where they would begin their education and learn what it meant to be a true Spartan. During this training, they were also taught that their allegiance to Sparta was more important than anything else in their life. This included their family, wealth, or power. A Spartan child was taught how to be deadly in combat and never to disobey the orders of their commanders or their kings. This blind dedication and the elite combat skills acquired at a young age is what made Spartan warriors so deadly on the battlefield. In 480 BCE, tales and poems would spread throughout Greece about the bravery and strength of the Spartans. It was at this time that King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans led a small force of Athenians and other Greeks against the massive army of Xerxes of Persia. These brave Spartan warriors held Xerxes' forces at the hot gates of Thermopylae for 3 days. No matter what the Persians threw at them, King Leonidas and his men repelled attack after attack. Xerxes even deployed his most deadly warriors, known as the Immortals, to try and break the Spartan line, but even they failed. In the end, Leonidas and his forces were betrayed by a fellow Greek who told Xerxes of a mountain pass that led behind the Spartan line. This allowed his men to surround the Spartan soldiers. The sacrifice of King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae became legendary. It gave the people of Greece the time they needed to organize their forces and repel the Persians, forcing them off the Greek lands. Around 50 years after the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta were the two major powers in Greece. Both wanted to spread their influence across Greece, which led to tensions between the two civilizations. These tensions quickly escalated into what became known as the Peloponnesian Wars, the result of which would lead to Sparta becoming the most powerful city-state in all of Greece, but would also cause their downfall. Between the Persian War and the First Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta carried out constant raids on one another. This led to skirmishes and battles that cost men and resources, but never escalated to all-out war. Then, in winter of 445 BCE, Sparta signed a peace treaty with Athens that was supposed to last for 30 years. However, in 431, Corinth, one of Sparta's allies, engaged the Athenian army in battle. When Athens retaliated by invading Corinth's lands, Sparta came to its aid. This broke the 30 years peace treaty, and the Second Peloponnesian War begun. Sparta launched campaigns into Athenian territories where they decimated their forces, sacked their cities, and conquered their land. Knowing that they could not beat the Spartans in combat on land, the Athenians took to the seas and used their navy as a way to wreak havoc on Sparta. The Athenians launched raids from the sea, where their ships dominated the open and coastal waters. Before and after the Persian War, Athens built up an armada of fast ships that could maneuver into narrow waterways. This allowed them to land almost anywhere along the Spartan coastline. Their ships would anchor just offshore, and Athenian troops would attack Spartan settlements. Before Sparta could reposition their forces, the Athenians would retreat to the safety of the Mediterranean and the Aegean seas and then relocate to conduct another raid. The inability of Sparta to conquer the city of Athens due to its fortified position and the fact that the Athenian army would never be able to beat Spartan forces on land led to an eventual stalemate. In 421, it was agreed upon by both sides that Sparta and Athens would protect each other for the next 50 years. This meant the two city-states would not go to war with one another while what came to be known as the Peace of Nicaea was in place. Both societies were strong and their influence spread far and wide, so it seemed that everyone should have been satisfied for the time being. However, this was not the case. Only 6 years into the peace treaty, Sparta attacked Athenian territories once again. Sparta had become so powerful that it hungered for more land and resources. They did not want to make the rest of Greece Spartan, as their societal system was based around keeping Spartan citizenship exclusive to certain bloodlines. But they did want to grow their empire so they could acquire more men to fight in their armies as helots and bring further wealth to their people. This time, all of the allies of each city-state joined the fight. This put the Delian League led by Athens against the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta. War raged on for several more years. In 420 BCE, Sparta was excluded from the Olympic Games for breaking their sacred truce and throwing Greece into chaos once again. In 404 BCE, the war finally came to an end when Athens was defeated by Sparta at Agospotami. The Spartans had learned from their previous mistakes. They had to stop the Athenian navy if they were ever going to defeat their enemy. So they spent some time and resources between the Peloponnesian Wars to improve their own ships and make them comparable to what the Athenians had. The Spartan general Lysander led the Spartan navy to victory at Agospotami, which brought the war to a close. Yet, even with Sparta being victorious in the Peloponnesian Wars and extending their empire across Greece, the great civilization was on the verge of collapse. Sparta was now the strongest city-state in the region, yet it had a population problem. The reason for extending their borders was not because there were too many people within its territory. On the contrary, the population of Sparta was actually in decline, and it had been declining for a while now. The Spartans were the minority in their own empire. They lost enormous amounts of men during the Peloponnesian War, and all of their combat wins were bittersweet as every conflict cost them citizen warriors. Now that the war with Athens was over, Sparta desperately needed to grow its population to replenish the soldiers lost in battle. Without a strong army, there would be no way to maintain control over their empire. But even though they knew this was a problem, the citizens of Sparta didn't seem to do much about it. Rather than focusing on increasing their population and strengthening their homeland, Sparta continued to wage war wherever they saw fit. Now that they were the dominant force in Greece, it seemed the conservative nature of Spartan society had gone out the window, and its citizens only desired more power and wealth. Spartan forces continuously broke alliances and invaded new territories. This led to revolts throughout the empire. One way to increase population size would have been to allow people from outside of Sparta to join their society, but this was against the strict rules that Sparta had been following for hundreds of years. These rules not only hindered any efforts to grow the number of Spartan citizens, but the old rules also made it nearly impossible to quickly train more soldiers. The only way to become a Spartan warrior was to make it through the agoge, and one of the key tenets of this process was that a student must supply his own armor and make it all the way through the rigorous and intensive training. If someone could not do these things, they were not allowed to become a Spartan warrior. Since not everyone who joined the agoge made it through, the number of Spartan soldiers continued to diminish. This meant that Sparta had to rely heavily on outsiders to supplement their armies. These soldiers were rarely as well trained as the Spartans, and they were not as devoted to the Spartan cause as its citizens were. But it wasn't just a lack of replacement soldiers and the dependence on outside help that caused the decline of Sparta in the years following the Peloponnesian War. Spartan leaders themselves began to become greedy and forget their traditional values to honor and protect the state. Generals and soldiers became more interested in themselves than keeping Sparta strong. These changes in attitude and their desire to accumulate more wealth for themselves rather than bolster the status of the state led to a wealth gap within Spartan society. Some citizens were becoming incredibly rich, while others were becoming poorer and poorer. As can be expected, this created some tension against the Spartans. But the wealth difference also led to another problem, something that would further exacerbate the dwindling number of Spartan soldiers. As Spartan families became poorer, they could not afford to pay for equipment that their children needed to participate in the agoge. It was not that the young citizens wouldn't have made excellent warriors, but the fact that they could not purchase their own armor meant they were ineligible to be trained as Spartan soldiers. It's unclear if this was a problem recognized by the kings of Sparta and other prominent members of society, or if they just didn't care. But the poor citizens of Sparta were becoming more discontent with the way their city-state was being run, while simultaneously being unable to fulfill their military duties. And without a pool of new soldiers, there was no way to keep the Spartan Empire alive. By 375 BCE, things had become really bad for Sparta. There were uprisings across Greece, and some of their enemies were gaining a lot of power. One city-state in particular was becoming an enormous thorn in Sparta's side. This part of Greece would be responsible for the collapse of the Spartan Empire. Thebes had become increasingly powerful in the years since Sparta and its allies had won the Peloponnesian War. Spartan forces had maintained control of the region for about 30 years, but they were slowly being pushed out of Thebes. This was unacceptable, so Sparta launched a campaign to subdue Thebans. In 371 BCE, King Cleombrotus led Spartan forces into battle against General Epaminondas, who commanded the Theban army. This decisive battle would be fought at Leuctra, and the outcome would not only be unexpected but would change the course of Greek history forever. Cleombrotus had just over 10,000 men at his disposal. However, due to the serious lack of Spartan soldiers, only around 700 of his men were Spartan warriors. This meant that the remaining men might fight well, but would be nowhere near as effective as a force made up of purely 10,000 Spartans. But this was a new reality of Spartan warfare. Even a king had to make do with only a few true Spartans in his ranks. Supplementing his soldiers, Cleombrotus also had around 1,000 cavalry. After years of fighting to keep Sparta in control of their empire, the men who were recruited from other city-states as helots were much less enthusiastic about going into battle than the Spartan king would want. On the other side of the field, 7,000 hoplites and 600 cavalry riders made up the Theban army. Epaminondas knew that the Theban cavalry consisted of some of the best riders in all of Greece, and he would most certainly use them to his advantage. But the biggest advantage of all for Thebes was that Epaminondas himself was a brilliant military strategist. He had already won a number of battles and would make Sparta pay for oppressing the people of Thebes. Most of the older Theban military leaders tried to persuade Epaminondas to retreat behind the walls of Thebes and make the Spartans siege the city. But Epaminondas would not be intimidated by the Spartans, and retreat was not an option for him. He surmised that he could outmaneuver the Spartan soldiers due to the fact that he already knew what their strategy would be. They had been using the same phalanx tactics for hundreds of years. It almost always worked, but Epaminondas concocted a plan that might just break the lines of Sparta and allow his forces to destroy them once and for all. At the beginning of the battle, Cleombrotus did exactly what Epaminondas expected. The Spartans set up a phalanx formation 12 men deep with 2 wings. Traditionally, the right wing has more heavily guarded than the left, and this is where Cleombrotus is located with his 300 bodyguards. Seeing this as a weakness, Epaminondas decides to make his enemy pay for not being more innovative with their tactics. He had his forces lined up 50 deep on the left wing and make his lines narrower. Epaminondas also launched his cavalry from the left wing to create a formidable force that would cut through the Spartans. The 2 Greek forces slammed into each other. Spears slashed through flesh, shields shattered, soldiers fell from fatal blows. The ground became soaked in blood. But then something incredible happened. The Spartan line broke. This allowed the Theban cavalry to rush through the enemy line and wreak havoc on the soldiers from within their ranks. The Theban soldiers followed the cavalry through the break and surrounded the Spartans. Everything began to fall apart for Cleombrotus and his forces. While all that was going on, Epaminondas had his forces attack at an angle toward the left. This pushed Cleombrotus and his Spartan warriors further away from the main fighting of the battle. They were unable to reposition in time to provide support for the broken line. In a desperate attempt to try and salvage the battle, Cleombrotus broke rank with his men and rushed toward the opposite side of the battlefield. The elite Theban soldiers known as the Sacred Band were already in position. As the Spartans approached, they were caught off guard. Cleombrotus was killed, and the Spartan forces had to retreat. It was the first time Sparta had lost a major battle in recent memory, and it would be the turning point for the Spartan Empire, as this would be the first of many battles they would lose. Epaminondas used the momentum from the defeat of Cleombrotus and his Spartan forces to move deeper into Spartan territory. He did not try to conquer the peoples of their lands. Instead, he freed them from Spartan rule. Epaminondas knew that if he could get the Helots and other indentured servants of the Spartans to rise up, it would weaken the great empire even more. After the loss at Leuctra, the Peloponnesian League was dissolved. Most of Sparta's allies felt they no longer needed to be a part of the League as Sparta was slowly falling apart, and they were more of a liability at this point anyway. Helots and slaves of the former Spartan Empire began to fight back. Independent city-states began to pop up around Greece once again. After defeating Sparta, Thebes became the most powerful city-state in the region. They threatened to create a new empire which many Greeks did not want to be a part of. In 371 BCE, Athens tried to hold a peace conference to prevent further war, but the Thebans refused. They had crushed Spartan forces and removed them from their lands. It seemed as if nothing could stop them now, and they were right. Things got so desperate that Sparta and Athens decided to put aside their differences and fight alongside one another against Thebes. But Thebes had found a new ally, someone who had once threatened the Greek way of life. Thebes allied themselves with Persia, who helped them continue their conquest of Greece. This alliance went on to defeat Sparta and Athens even as they worked together. There was nowhere else for the warriors of Sparta to go but back home, even though they had lost all their empire and influence. Sparta remained an independent city-state. They had the best warriors in all of Greece, but they had overextended themselves following the Peloponnesian War, which cost them greatly. Now, they only had enough soldiers to keep their city-states at bay as they tried to regroup and figure out what to do next. It's estimated that the Spartan population declined by over half, from around 9,000 to 4,000 citizens, between its height and the loss of the battle at Leuctra. This was mostly due to the death of soldiers during battle, even if the soldiers ended up winning the fight. And now that their forces had been weakened and they lacked sufficient numbers of young citizens to train as soldiers, there was no way to conquer the surrounding areas and force their inhabitants to fight as helots. Things became so bad that Spartans began allowing non-citizens the chance to join their society to try and increase their numbers, but even this didn't work. As the Spartan population continued to decline, the number of people in the surrounding city-states began to grow. They no longer needed to fear the Spartans. Sparta kept to itself for over a century. Of course, the warrior civilization continued to raid the lands around them, but they did not have the power or resources to rebuild their empire while also keeping invading forces in check. The last king of an independent Sparta was Nabis. He had reached the throne by executing 2 other Spartans who had a stronger claim than he did. In order to ensure that he would not be opposed, he ended their 2 bloodlines. Nabis was not a nice man and did not have the honor that the Spartans were known for. He was greedy and selfish. After becoming king, Nabis decided it was time for Sparta to regain some of its former glory. But he did not want this because it would benefit the average Spartan citizen, but to make himself more powerful and wealthy. He sided with Macedon during the Macedonian Wars and was able to secure more territory for Sparta, but when the tides of battle suddenly shifted, Nabis decided to jump ship and throw Sparta's support behind Rome. Eventually, peace was reached between Rome and Macedonia, but Nabis still had his eye on creating a Spartan empire. This led to the Laconian War of 195 BC, which was fought between Sparta and an alliance composed of Rome, the Achaean League, Pergamum, Rhodes, and Macedon. During the Macedonian Wars, Sparta gained control of Argos. Rome let them control the territory as payment for their military service. This territory was incorporated into Laconia, which was the region of Greece controlled by Sparta at the time. Nabis stripped the wealthy landowners of Argos of everything they had and redistributed it to helots who were only loyal to him. He also started building a powerful navy and fortified Sparta to ensure its safety for what was to come. Socially, Nabis tried to provide more economic opportunities for Spartan citizens, which in turn would help rebuild its army. But this was a slow process. He freed the slaves in Argos, which were then conscripted as helots to improve the military strength of Sparta. So really, they were just going from one oppressive ruler to another. Nabis seemed to be making good on his promise to create a more powerful Sparta, but he would not get to see his final plans come to fruition. When the Macedonian War ended, the Spartans refused to give up their new territory. Rome tried diplomacy to convince Nabis that he needed to hand over Argos to the Achaean League, but he refused. This led to the coalition of Greek and Roman powers declaring war on Sparta. The Romans and their allies attacked the coastal cities of the Laconian region and stripped them from Sparta. Argos was marched upon and captured by the Achaean League. Sparta was just not strong enough to repel the might of Rome combined with the other Greek city-states. This was the final nail in the coffin for Sparta. The slight gains they had made were completely wiped out, and they did not have the strength or time to rebuild their crumbling civilization before what was to come next. Sparta was stripped of its independence, and they were kept under close watch of Rome. Nabis ruled for a little while longer until he was assassinated in 192 BC. The last king of a free Sparta was now dead, and any dream of another Spartan empire died with him. Several years after the Laconian War ended, the Achaean League tried its best to maintain diplomatic relations with Rome, while also ruling their region of Greece as they saw fit. However, the Romans made it clear that the Achaean League was not to expand their territory any further, especially not into Sparta. The Achaeans had wanted to incorporate Sparta into their league since the Laconian War, but had held off out of fear of upsetting the Romans. The problem was that the Achaean League still had to deal with Spartan raids into their lands, which was becoming a real annoyance. But when the Achaeans brought this up to Rome, all they did was send some emissaries to try and negotiate peace. Sparta did not honor the agreement decided upon by these talks. In 148 BCE, the Achaean League had had enough and invaded Sparta. They successfully entered the city-state and subjugated the Spartan people. Rome saw this as unacceptable and an insult to the arrangement they decided upon with the Achaean states. The Romans launched an invasion into Archaea. Spartans demanded their independence and fought back against the invaders. The Achaean League now had to deal with Spartan forces and Rome at the same time. This combination ended up being more than the Achaean League could handle. Roman soldiers swept through the territory and claimed it as their own. The Achaeans can no longer be trusted to make their own choices, so the Roman statesman Lucius Mummius ordered any walls protecting a city that was involved in the revolt by the Achaean League to be torn down. This restructuring of the region under Roman rule included the subjugation of Sparta. Eventually, Rome allowed Sparta and Athens to once again be independent city-states. This freedom meant very little, though, as Sparta had been occupied for so long that they had lost almost everything that had made their civilization unique in the first place. To add insult to injury, in 267 CE, the Goths raided Greece from the north and sacked Sparta. The Spartans could not even defend their homeland anymore. The fall of one of the greatest Greek empires that ever existed was now complete. Sparta had grown from a nomadic tribe into a powerful city-state, held back Xerxes with only 300 warriors, conquered the Athenians, and formed a powerful empire. Unfortunately, they overextended themselves and everything they worked so hard for fell apart. The Spartan people tried to maintain their identity but ultimately were conquered. However, even today, the Spartans are still talked about as one of the greatest warrior civilizations that ever existed.
Modern Western civilization can trace its roots to ancient Greece, with the foundations for military and government systems drawn from two of the most legendary city-states to ever exist, Athens and Sparta. Athens would inspire Western civilization to rule fairly and espouse democratic ideals, while Sparta would form the backbone of military traditions meant to defend that democracy. But what was life really like in ancient Sparta? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're asking, what was life like for a Spartan warrior? Spartan society was, well, Spartan. It was a civilization that eschewed luxury and comfort in favor for discipline, precision, and obedience. Its men and women were wholly dedicated to the Spartan military, with almost the entirety of their efforts spent every day in supporting or strengthening Sparta's ability to wage war. Spartan citizens weren't even allowed to engage in trading, and coins were outlawed. Every free citizen was equal. There was no gender or wealth gap, as engaging in trade or even making clothing and farming was seen as work only fit for slaves to do. There was no 1% as there was no interest in amassing wealth. Sadly, there was also little interest in the arts, science, or philosophy, unless it served the military. A Spartan soldier's life began at birth, with the child inspected and discarded if found to be physically or mentally handicapped in any way. When a child reached age 5, they would be inspected once more and killed if found to be too unhealthy. Sparta had no room for the weak. At age 7, male children were taken to a local agoge, a sort of military academy boot camp. From that moment on, a Spartan child no longer belonged to his parents, but rather to the state as a whole. At the agoge, Spartan children were purposefully underfed and encouraged to steal food, only to be severely beaten if they were caught. But not because stealing was wrong, but because they were in fact caught. This was meant to teach them to be stealthy and crafty, but also to endure hunger, as they may have to in the midst of a long campaign. You didn't have to be caught doing anything wrong in order to earn a beating though, as part of a Spartan child's training in becoming a soldier included routine and random beatings meant to ensure they grew up tough. Living in groups under the tutelage of an older man, boys were encouraged to fight amongst themselves to determine who was the strongest, although they were strictly taught to never fight each other in anger or hold grudges. This too was purely pragmatic rather than philosophical, as it ensured that morale stayed good amongst soldiers fighting side by side. Spartan children were not given beds to sleep on, but instead had to make their own from tough reeds pulled from riverbanks by hand, and forget about sheets or blankets. At age 12, they were given only a single item of clothing a year, a red cloak, and would not earn shoes until graduating into military service, going barefoot even in the middle of winter. This would prepare Spartan soldiers for the reality of life on the campaign trail, as Spartans did not carry sleeping cots, tents, or even blankets with them as they marched, sleeping on the ground itself wrapped only in their clothes. At age 12, a Spartan child was put under the tutelage of an older soldier in a sort of mentor relationship. Although many Greeks often made claims about pederasty in Spartan society, this one-on-one relationship was meant to pass on knowledge and experience, as well as build loyalty between soldiers and from the young child to the state. At age 18, a Spartan youth would then be initiated into adulthood through a practice called the Crypteia, a ritual seen as barbaric and brutal by the rest of the civilized world. During the Crypteia, Spartan teenagers formed into small groups and were tasked with murdering a number of slaves. Sometimes blades were provided, other times they were left to fend for themselves and improvise weapons or murder with their bare hands. The teenagers would then look for the largest and strongest of slaves and ambush the slave when unawares. Weak slaves or female slaves were rarely targeted, as they were not seen as a great threat, and thus it was the biggest and strongest who were at risk of being murdered. Though participants in a Crypteia could be punished with beatings if caught, the beatings were punishment not for the murder, but for actually being caught. Slaves had no rights or protections, and in fact, every year the ruling Spartan body would declare war on their slaves, so their murder was not seen as a murder, but rather as a casualty in an ongoing war. Considering that Spartans relied completely on their slaves for everything from sewing their clothes to trading with the other city-states, it may seem insane that murder of their own slaves was encouraged and even mandated, but for all their warrior might, Spartans lived in constant fear of their slave population. Outnumbering normal Spartans 7-1, Spartans were all too aware that a revolt could be devastating to the city-state, and in fact, it very nearly ended a Spartan rule around 490 BC when slaves revolted and nearly overthrew the Spartan government. From that day on, Spartans kept a very tight leash on their slaves, and once even put wreaths on the heads of 2,000 of their strongest slaves and promised them their freedom only to lead them away to a temple and slaughter them all. At age 20, Spartans officially became part of the army, but they were not allowed to marry and live together in barracks until the age of 30. During this time, they also competed fiercely with each other for entry into the Spartan Hippeis, a royal guard of honor, of which only 300 of the best warriors would be chosen to accompany the king. Also at age 20, Spartans were voted into one of several public messes, with votes cast by members of those messes. Think of it as pledging to a fraternity the way college students do today, only with far less partying and drinking, as most Spartans did not drink alcohol and were warned against it from childhood. For Spartans, alcohol and any other substance that incapacitated you was seen seen as building weakness, and slaves would often be forced to get drunk on alcohol and then be publicly humiliated so that Spartan children could see the dangers of drinking. Votes for entry into a mess had to be unanimous, and this would build a strong camaraderie between the members of that mess and ensure cohesiveness in battle. Spartans had until the age of 30 to gain entry into a mess, after which if they still had not gained entry, they would be denied full Spartan citizenship, which means they were not allowed to vote or hold office. Upon joining the army at age 20, Spartans drilled day and night in battle formations. Spartan armies made the use of the dreaded phalanx formation, in which rows of soldiers would be stacked one after the other, with each soldier's shield protecting the right flank of the man next to him. This created an impenetrable wall of bronze bristling with spear points that was nearly impossible to defeat as long as it held its cohesiveness. Yet, as powerful as the phalanx was, if discipline failed for even a second and the army forced an opening, the entire formation would shatter, leaving soldiers vulnerable and exposed. This, in essence, was the entire point of Spartan training. The phalanx must never break, and in fact, Spartan phalanxes hardly ever did. With row after row of soldiers, each Spartan would push his shield into the back of the man in front of him, pushing the entire formation forward and pressing into the enemy. Those on the first 3 or 4 ranks would stab out with their spears or hurl them at the enemy, and if injured or cut down, the man behind him would immediately take their place. A living tank of bronze, leather, and human muscle. The Greek phalanx was a thing to be greatly feared, as the Persians would learn, and few were more formidable than those made up of Spartan men. Spartan society revolved entirely around their military might, and their adult life from ages 7 to 60 was devoted entirely to training and fighting. While not at war, Spartans spent every waking moment training and drilling, honing themselves for future battles. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch commented that for Spartans, war was seen as almost a holiday, saying their bodily exercises were less rigorous during their campaigns, and they were allowed a regimen less rigid. They were the only men in the world for whom war brought a respite in the training for war. Yet brutally overseeing a population of slaves that outnumbered them greatly and routinely rebelled against them, it's perhaps little wonder that Spartans dedicated themselves wholly to fighting. In the end though, this myopic focus on fighting would lead to Spartans influencing the military traditions of the modern Western world, but it would be their hated rivals, Athens, who would truly be the shining beacon of philosophy, science, and democracy that built a brighter future for mankind. Picture this, a 6'2" Navy SEAL who's just reveling in his victory, receiving the certification to officially be able to call himself one. He's been through hell and back to earn this. He's convinced that what he's endured as a SEAL has prepared him with the ultimate mindset to conquer anything. He's sweat and ran and jumped and traversed through water only on 4 hours of sleep at times. And then, in the blink of an eye, he's in a battle surrounded by mean and scary-looking Spartan soldiers. The men are kind of similar, yet very different, than his SEAL comrades he got so close to during training. After all, his superiors drilled it into their heads that this brotherhood was essential to winning. But now, he's alone and forced to confront a battle that he's never seen the likes of before. Could he do it? We'll take a closer look at his odds and more in this episode of the Infographics Show, a Navy SEAL versus the 300 Spartans from the Battle of Thermopylae. The tension that caused the Battle of Thermopylae all started with Darius I, the king of Persia, who ruled from 522 to 486. He sent heralds or announcers to Greek cities in 491 BCE to convince them to yield to Persian rule. His predecessor Xerxes followed suit, invading Greece, but not Athens or Sparta, both of which formed a resistance. To help dissect what the odds are, let's backtrack and do a deep dive into what Navy SEAL training is like to see how he'd fare in a scenario he's just been dropped in. Even before starting the BUDS training or basic underwater demolition SEAL training, he had to endure the Naval Special Warfare Prep in Great Lakes, Illinois for 2 months of physical and mental preparation. Rewinding to even before then, he took the ASVAB, which stands for the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. This tested skills like mathematical reasoning, word knowledge, and paragraph comprehension, all of which seemed pretty useless when Spartans are coming at him with spears and swords. The Computerized Special Operations Resilience Test, or CSORT, was completely like the ASVAB, but at least a bit more useful. This test was designed to determine his mental toughness, something that a paper study guide couldn't possibly help him with. The CSORT was designed to see how he'd hold up in stressful situations, and if he could employ different tactics to get through them, like self-talk and breathing. He passed that, and he'll certainly need that resilience now. The sea sword also aimed to vet our personality traits and see who was the fittest. While his SEAL Brotherhood was made up of different types of personalities, there are certainly personality traits that give candidates like him an edge over the others, the most important of which was resilience. It didn't stop there. Of course, he wanted to master the Navy SEAL training, but he had to prove that he could do the 500-yard swim in 12 minutes and 30 seconds, 42 push-ups in 50 seconds, 52 sit-ups in 2 minutes, curl-ups, and 1.5-mile run in 9 minutes and 30 seconds. The surf passage test he went through during BUD/S is etched into his memory too. He distinctly remembers the clothes that clung to his tired body as he held heavy paddle inflatable boats through the waves at the Silver Strand Beach in San Diego. So if this battle's got any serious water to trek through, he can do that. BUD/S is the main part of SEAL training, and it was held at Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Coronado, California, and was the next step. For 6 months, he and other almost SEALs crawled through the mud, tied nearly impossible knots underwater, and were on the brink of hypothermia. This was all designed to break him down mentally, but he did something right. Hell Week, the aptly named part of BUD/S, began 2 weeks in, on day 15 of overall training. Hell Week meant swimming miles upon miles through unholy cold waters and then toiling through sand and mud in heavy gear. On top of all that, Hell Week was made even more fun because he was running on just 4 hours of sleep throughout the ordeal. One ex-SEAL, a guy named Marcus Luttrell, said this about Hell Week in his book Lone Survivor. Guys collapsed onto the sand, others just stood there, too many of them wondering how they could possibly go on. And he went on to include himself in this account of his suffering, writing, "Including me, knees were buckling, joints throbbing. I don't think anyone could stand up without hurting." Because he survived Hell Week, he was one of the lucky ones who continued on to train in diving and land warfare, learn to become a sniper who could leap out of planes, and navigate the depths of the ocean. Sniper school lasted 3 months and was made of 12-hour days without any off days. Training was broken up into 3 parts. The first month was focused on technology, digital photography, and satellite communications. The second focused on mastering camouflage and stealthily navigating through prospective enemy turf. The last leg was focused on sharpening his focus and perfecting marksmanship methods. But he was one of the few who made it through Hell Week and BUD/S, generally because about 70% of their peers just straight up quit. Ringing that bell signifies utter defeat. Okay, so it's pretty clear being a Navy SEAL gives him an edge over the average Joe on the street. But these are the Spartan 300 we're talking about here. It's looking like less of a battle and more like a heavy defeat. And here's why. Well, for one, it's him against an army of 7,000 Greek soldiers, 300 of which are Spartans. And these men have primed since they were 7 years old. Yeah, that's right. When he was still in 1st grade coloring and really nailing down this whole reading thing, Spartan boys were sent off to enter a weird-sounding thing called an agoga, where these tinies were subjected to awful circumstances. Think of the way training tried to break him down mentally, but happening as a wee tyke. To help picture what the agoga was like, it was a state-sponsored training program to turn kids into soldiers from this very early age. They were housed in a barracks with all the other would-bes and were immersed in academics, warfare, and sports. At 12 was when the torture started, though. Initiates, as they were called at that age and state of the agoga, were stripped of all clothes except for a red cloak. They were also made to sleep outside on a bed that they made for themselves from reeds. If that wasn't enough to make our SEAL shake in his boots, they gave these kids a limited amount of food and were violently punished when things went wrong. After 14 years of being subjected to this, they were signed on to serve a term that lasted 40 years. But all of this training and these brutal conditions made them unstoppable. In the 8th century BC, Sparta conquered Laconia and Messenia. The captives from these 2 cities were made slaves for the Spartans, at their beck and call for farming, nursing, and domestic servitude in Spartan homes and military attendance. The Spartans continued this streak by being victorious and capturing neighboring city-states, garnering more slaves. And they weren't too different from the brotherhood we mentioned earlier that he formed with our SEAL's own platoon. They stood together to not let anything stand in their way of fighting for their country. So what about the weapons he'll be faced with during this battle? He can expect to see an intense spear called a dory. The dory was typically gripped with one hand, either over or under, and the other hand was freed up to be used to hold a shield. Spartans would grip the spear with leather to further solidify their grip on it. The end of the dory was made of bronze or iron welded to be in the shape of a leaf, and its shaft was made of cornel wood, a wood so dense that it sank in water. The end of the dory had a sauroter, a spike that helped the spear stay upright when propped up, or was the alternate end they used when the spearhead broke off for whatever reason. Spartan hoplites also used a schipos, a short sword that was considered their secondary weapon. Its iron blade was typically 12 to 18 inches. The schipos was advantageous to the Spartans because it could be easily thrust through their opponent's shields and armors.
The typical spots being aimed at during battle with the Shiphos was the groin and the throat. The kopis, a thick curved iron sword, was another option as a secondary weapon. Although typically used as an axe rather than a sword, its victims suffered from messier wounds as opposed to the cleaner hole made by the weapons we've already gone over. Finally, we can't discuss Spartan weapons without mentioning the shield, which of course could be turned upwards when used during defense, but its multiple other uses include stunning the opponent and knocking them down. Because it was so heavy at 30 pounds, it was used to just club the opponent and they'd be hurt just by the blunt force of the trauma. So while we wanted him to survive this battle, it looks like our SEAL's chances to win are just too slim this time, and he might just kick the bucket.
A wave of Aztec warriors slams against the Spartan phalanx. Bronze spears jut out from behind the wall of shields, slashing the flesh of the unarmored Aztec soldiers. From behind the front lines, wooden spears fly through the air, impaling themselves into several Spartan hoplites. An elite Aztec warrior climbs on top of the shoulders of the men fighting against the impenetrable Spartan wall. He launches himself over the Spartan shields and lands amongst their ranks. The Aztec slams his obsidian club into one of the nearby soldiers, knocking him out. He slashes the neck of another before several short swords penetrate his chest, but at that point the damage is done. The Spartan phalanx has been broken, and with it, the war could be lost. Aztec and Spartan soldiers were two of the most deadly fighters of the past. They never met as the two civilizations were separated by time and distance. But if they had, who would win? In this scenario, we'll imagine what would happen if the Aztec and Spartan armies met one another on the battlefield at the height of their power. Only one civilization can claim victory. Let's find out who will come out on top. Both sides prepare for war. Their motivations for fighting and what victory means are very different. The Aztecs and Spartans each want more land, resources, and people to grow their empires. However, the Aztecs also need to capture sacrificial victims to offer to their gods. Every able-bodied Aztec man is expected to participate in the Song of Shields, where they go on conquest to battle and capture other warriors and bring them back for large festivals where the victims get sacrificed to the gods by priests and shamans. This tactic has worked for the Aztecs, as they're now in control of 200,000 square kilometers of territory. This land is broken up into 38 provinces. From within the empire, they extract tribute from 371 city-states, all of which help maintain the thriving Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The constant warring and battles to gather sacrificial victims have made the Aztec army practically unbeatable. The Spartans launched their military campaigns mostly to deal with existential threats, such as invasion forces from foreign lands. Epic battles like the one at the hot gates of Thermopylae have secured the position of Spartan warriors as some of the fiercest fighters in history. The Spartans control around 8,500 square kilometers, and when they dispatch soldiers to the surrounding area, it's not to collect sacrificial victims, but to suppress slave revolts and put city-states that have ideas of freedom in their place. Sparta also keeps an eye on their Greek neighbors in Athens and Thebes. Both of these cultures are constantly at odds with Sparta. But when Sparta goes to war, it is to gain power inland. They have no interest in taking enemy soldiers alive. The battlefield will be covered in their enemy's blood as the Spartan army marches toward a final epic battle against their new foe, the Aztecs. Aztec citizens have been preparing for the coming war since the day they were born. They're indoctrinated into a culture that rewards bravery and keen battle skills. From a young age, boys train in special military compounds where they're taught how to use different weapons and tactics for defeating an enemy while also taking them alive. After hours of training, they're told stories of the gods and the brave Aztec warriors who served them. Their entire childhood is based around war and sacrifice. During campaigns to capture sacrificial victims, the Aztec children accompany the warriors as porters. They're to carry extra weapons and spears while also witnessing the glories of war. The soldiers in training watch the battle from afar to gain more insight into how an Aztec warrior fights and to learn tactics that will help them become as deadly and cunning as the greatest heroes in the army. Eventually, they're ready to graduate from training and join the ranks as true Aztec warriors, but first they must prove themselves. The young soldiers are sent to battle, where they're required to take their first captive alive. They use their obsidian clubs called makwawit to wound their victims before knocking them out and tying them up with cord. Then the young warriors bring their sacrifice back to the veterans, who congratulate them and welcome them into their ranks. The young warriors cut off their long hair, which has been growing since the age of 10, and they are now men. The Spartans also train their children to become warriors from a young age. At the age of 7, males are sent to an agoge, where they're taught how to fight and think like a Spartan warrior. These boys live in group barracks and are put through rigorous training each day, only to go to sleep tired and wake up exhausted to do it all over again. They train for over 10 years before moving out of the agoge and joining the ranks of the Spartan army. It's this rigorous training at such a young age that instills discipline in each Spartan warrior. They're able to follow orders without a second thought. Entire units can move as one as they march across the battlefield in their phalanx structure. The training to become a Spartan warrior is so difficult that the Spartans look forward to going to battle because it's easier than training. The Greek historian Plutarch even writes their bodily exercises too were less rigorous during their campaigns and were allowed a regimen less rigid. They were the only men in the world for whom war brought a respite in the training for war. The thought of Spartan soldiers puts the fear of gods into the Greek citizens, but will they have the same effect on the Aztecs? Aztec spies called Kimichtin returned from an expedition to find out what lies beyond the empire's current boundaries. They disguise themselves as local merchants, but in reality they walk among the enemy forces not to trade goods but to gather intel. They bring back word to the king of an army made up of strangely dressed soldiers with shining armor and long spears. The Aztec king calls on the warriors from across the empire to gather and launch a campaign against the foreign threat that called themselves Spartans. 400 men from each city are sent toward the enemy. Each of these units is commanded by its own senior warriors and are part of a group consisting of around 8,000 men. 24 of these divisions link up at the edge of the Aztec Empire, creating a force of 200,000 warriors. The huge army begins making its way toward the Spartans. In the lead are the scouting units. They wear yellow face paint and carry conch shells to signal the main force that's behind them. Within the leading group of scouts are also priests who adorn themselves with images of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec sun god and the god of war. These priests will ensure that the gods are on the Aztec sides and will be able to make any sacrifice needed to appease the gods once the battles start. The priests cover themselves in bright quetzal feathers and wear jade emblems pierced through their skin. The main force of the Aztec army extends for 25 kilometers as they march toward the Spartans. The most elite units are toward the front of the procession. Most of these warriors come from major cities. The warriors of Tenochtitlan are in the very front. The king of the Aztecs has joined the army and he'll make most wartime decisions with the aid of his Chiocuatl, or second-in-command. 4 other warlords loyal to the king also stay by his side to aid in strategic decisions. They give orders to the commanders of each unit, who then disseminate the directives to their men. The Spartans have been warned of the imminent Aztec attack. They sound the call to arms. Every soldier in the army gathers outside the city before marching toward the battlefield. However, before they begin their campaign, a sacrifice must be made. As the sun rises, the Spartan king communes with the gods. His soldiers look on as he slaughters a goat. The warm crimson blood spills onto the ground. The soldiers say their prayers and suit up for the coming war. Every day they march, the Spartans also exercise. The warriors know they must keep their bodies limber for the coming battle. And just because they're about to engage an enemy does not mean that they can forego their daily workouts. They will meet their enemy the following day and all hell will break loose. Each Spartan warrior carries his own weapons. They have a helot slave that holds the other belongings, such as 20 days worth of food and water. All that the soldiers have to keep them warm are their long red capes. This has been the routine for hundreds of years. Spartan warriors don't sleep in tents or in large camps on their way to battle. Their hardened bodies lay on the rocky ground so they can rest under the twinkling stars of the heavens. The Spartans are vastly outnumbered. Their entire army consists of around 20,000 men. Most are helots and perioikoi, who are little more than men forced to fight or mercenaries. However, the 5,000 or so Spartan warriors who are true citizens should be more than enough to hold the line and decimate the enemy force. They pushed back the Persians from their homelands, and the Aztec threat should be no different. The day has come for the battle between the Aztecs and the Spartans. It's a warm summer morning. The sun peeks over the nearby hills, bathing the battlefield in a fiery glow. The Aztec priests did not sleep the previous night. Instead, they sacrificed Spartan citizens that strayed too far from the protection of their army or fortified towns. Huitzilopochtli must be offered enormous amounts of blood and human life to ensure victory for the Aztecs. The Spartans are doing the very same thing for their gods. Zeus is offered goats and pigs are sacrificed to Ares, the god of war. The official fire bearer, who carries the Pyphorus all the way from the sacred altar back in Sparta to the battlefields, lights an inferno. The sacred animals are cooked and consumed by the men. The Spartans bathe and braid the long hair of their comrades as they prepare for battle. This will ensure that if they fall during combat, they will be prepared to meet the gods in the afterlife. When the morning rituals are complete, a trumpet sounds. The Spartan warriors sing the Song of Castor in honor of the Spartan war hero and demigod. This will help ensure that they are looked after during the war while also gaining more favor with the divine entities that rule the battlefield. After the song ends, the men begin to line up in formation. Final orders are given by the Spartan king. Every soldier listens intently, as they would follow their king through the gates of Hades if he commanded it. Now that the gods have received their offerings from both sides, the battle can begin. The Spartans move away from their camp and set up their phalanx structure across the battlefield. They have a small cavalry force of a few hundred men set up to their side, ready to flank the enemy or provide support. The Aztec army is massive, and the field upon which they battle is much larger than the hot gates at Thermopylae. The Spartan lines are only 10 men deep, but as long as the shield wall isn't breached, they will be victorious. The sun glints off the bronze shields and shines directly toward the Aztec warriors, who are hollering and posturing before the battle begins. War drums boom from within the massive army. The conch shells trumpet, and screams of Aztec warriors fill the air. The Spartans have their own instruments as well. Soldiers within the ranks of the phalanx play flutes so that the soldiers might march in time together. The walls of Spartans slowly advance toward the Aztec enemy. The Aztecs hold their ground. They're waiting for the Spartans to get into range. As the phalanx approaches, the Aztec warriors release a barrage of javelins hurled by their atlatls. They are equipped with sharp rock or obsidian tips. Most of the javelins break against the Spartan armor, but some find their way into the weak spot between the breastplate and the helmet, where the neck is exposed. These lucky shots puncture the Spartans' necks, and blood pours out of their severed carotid arteries. Spartans continue to march, stepping over their wounded and making sure that their shields stay tightly locked in formation. They seem unfazed by the enemy's ranged weapons. Every soldier in the Spartan army has the fear beat out of them during their time in the Agoge. They were bred and raised for battle. Nothing will stand in their way as they prepare to decimate the enemy. The Aztec king and his advisors look upon the battlefield from an elevated platform. They scour the landscape for any advantage for their troops. This particular region is relatively flat and void of vegetation. It'll pit the Aztec army against the Spartan army in a way that only their weapons, skills, and tactics will make a difference. It's unclear who will be victorious. The war drums of the Aztecs stop. The sound of the Spartan flutes eerily wafts across the battlefield. The Spartans are still advancing while the Aztecs await a signal to charge. The drums start beating again. Their rhythm increases in intensity and speed. The shouts from the Aztec ranks resume as they're ordered forward to conquer the enemy and bring sacrificial victims back to the capital. The Aztec soldiers sprint toward the Spartan front line. They're covered in war. Their animal pelts flail out behind them. The Spartans continue at the same pace. The soldiers tense their muscles, getting ready for the impact of enemy soldiers against their shields. The Aztecs close the gap. They're 100 feet away, 50 feet, 10 feet. Then it happens. The Aztec warriors slam into the Spartan phalanx. For a moment, the Spartans are pushed back from impact, their feet digging into the dirt as they slide backward several feet. The initial momentum from the impact slows to a stop. The Aztec warriors bash the shields of the Spartans with their obsidian clubs and axes, but the bronze is too strong, and their weapons either graze off them or shatter. The Aztecs continue their onslaught, looking for a weak spot in the Spartan wall. They find none. The commanders of the Spartan army give the order to push. Every Spartan soldier in every row of the phalanx pushes forward at the same time. The Aztecs are forced several feet back. Milliseconds after the push, the soldiers in the second line of the phalanx thrust their spears through the small gaps in the shield wall. Their sharpened blades cut through Aztec flesh. Thousands of Aztec warriors are impaled by the bronze spear tips and die instantly. Their round chimale shields and finely woven cotton body armor, which has been soaked in salt water to make it more resistant, provide little protection against the Spartan weapons. The Spartan phalanx continues forward as they march over the fallen bodies of enemy soldiers. Men in the back of the phalanx make sure anyone still alive receives a spear through the heart before they rejoin the ranks of their peers. The Aztecs continue to try to break the line, but to no avail. The Spartan commanders spot a group of Aztec warriors breaking off from the main army to try to circle behind the phalanx. This cannot be allowed to happen. If the enemy gets behind them, all will be lost. A trumpet sounds. The Spartan cavalry rides around the main force to meet the flanking Aztec soldiers head-on. They tear through the Aztec ranks using their spears and short swords to decimate some of the most elite soldiers in the enemy army. The Aztecs are no match for the heavily armored Spartan soldiers that sit high atop their war horses. Several of the cavalry units are pulled from their steeds and slaughtered by obsidian blades. But most of the Aztec soldiers are forced to retreat back to the main body of their army for protection. Suddenly, a conch shell blows in rapid succession. The fighting stops as the Aztec army turns and runs in what appears to be a retreat. The front line is forced to keep fighting while the men in the back run away. Every now and then, a cunning Aztec warrior slips a knife through the shield wall and injures or kills a Spartan soldier. However, he is quickly replaced, so the phalanx never breaks. The Aztecs try to deflect the spears lashing out at them, but with very little success. The battlefield begins to clear. The Spartans do not let up. They continue their march forward. The Aztec force halts a few hundred feet away. Although the Spartans have killed thousands and thousands of Aztecs, they are still vastly outnumbered. The Aztecs have claimed the lives of a few hundred Spartans, and it seems that they're ready to battle once again. The Spartans continue toward the front line of the Aztec army. As they cross the battlefield, they notice the ground becomes soft and almost spongy under their feet. The Spartans pay little attention to this change in the texture of the ground and continue onward. This is new land for them, and the terrain is unfamiliar. When the Spartans approach the Aztec army, they notice the soldiers are smiling. It's as if they know something the Spartans do not. Suddenly, a series of blasts sound from the conch shells. The ground behind the Spartans begins to shift and explodes upward. The Aztecs had dug large holes under the cover of the previous night and hidden hundreds of soldiers in them. Before the sun rose, they concealed the holes with a false ground, so the warriors would be hidden until the opportune moment. That moment had arrived, and the hidden soldiers revealed themselves. Unfortunately for the Spartans, this Aztec force is now behind the phalanx. The main Aztec army darts forward and crashes into the shield wall once again. Simultaneously, the hidden Aztec warriors attack the soldiers in the back. The Aztecs have a plan. Once the hidden forces fiercely strike one section in the back of the Spartan army, the surprise attack catches them off guard, and many Spartan soldiers are brought down by obsidian clubs to the head. The Aztec soldiers force their way through the middle of the Spartan ranks, which are now being attacked from both the front and the back. These Aztecs have only one mission: break the shield wall. As the Aztec warriors make their way through the Spartans, they don't necessarily kill them, but they drive them aside so they can reach the front line. The final push by the hidden Aztec force breaks through the shield wall from the back. The Spartan warriors stagger forward as the Aztec soldiers shatter their defenses from behind. The Spartan phalanx has been broken and the army is now separated into two parts. The Aztecs rush through a gap to encircle the Spartans. This is a worst-case scenario for the Spartans. Now they are surrounded. Their phalanx no longer matters. The much larger Aztec army might not have weapons or armor that the Spartans have, but eventually they will overcome them through sheer numbers. But for each Spartan that falls to obsidian blades and well-placed atlatl darts, the Aztecs gain access to their enemy's deadly arsenal. The Aztec soldiers grab the bronze shields off the ground and short swords from the belts of Spartans. They use them to hack at the enemy as more and more Aztec warriors flood onto the battlefield and surround the Spartans. With access to the Spartan spears, the Aztecs are able to dismount the small cavalry force. As the battle rages on, there is a holler from one of the most respected warriors in the Aztec army. The soldiers surrounding him back off and form a circle. In the middle of the circle is a veteran Spartan soldier and the most deadly Aztec warrior in the entire army. They circle one another, sizing up their foe. The battling continues all around, but these two warriors are only focused on one another. The Aztec war hero rushes forward and jumps high into the air with his macuahuit raised over his head. The Spartan brings up his shield and deflects the blow from the Aztec warrior. He parries and thrusts his spear forward. It slices through the side of his enemy. The Aztec warrior backs off and touches the wound. He looks at the blood dripping from his fingers and smiles. He gives his adversary a slight bow as a sign of respect. But the Spartan is exhausted. Even though he has trained all his life for battle, the unrelenting waves of Aztec soldiers have sapped much of his energy. The Aztec warrior pulls out an obsidian knife, so he now holds a deadly weapon in each hand. He sprints toward the Spartan and waits for the right moment. The Spartan soldier thrusts his spear forward in hopes of impaling the Aztec through the stomach, but at the last moment he falls to his knees and slides under the spear tip. Using his momentum, the Aztec warrior slashes the Achilles tendon of the Spartan with his knife. The Spartan falls to one knee as the Aztec warrior stands back up. The Spartan soldier tosses his spear aside and draws his short sword, knowing that he'll have to fight for his life in close combat. The Aztec brings his macuahuit down just as the Spartan brings up his sword. They crash together. In that moment, the Spartan thrusts the side of his shield into the stomach of the Aztec, knocking him backward. However, as the Spartan tries to stand, the searing pain from his cut Achilles tendon causes him to fall back to the ground. The Aztec warrior recovers and kicks the Spartan in the chest, sending him falling backward. The Aztec warrior jumps on top of the Spartan. He slams the blunt end of the macuahuit into the Spartan's helmet, knocking him out. He will make an excellent sacrifice to the gods. All around the battlefield, Spartans begin to fall. In one-on-one combat, they defeat the Aztec warriors, but they're now outnumbered almost 100 to 1. There are just too many Aztecs, and in the end, sheer numbers cause the Spartan army to fall. All things being equal, if 1,000 Spartans were to go against 1,000 Aztecs, the Spartans would win every time. They have superior weapons and armor made of bronze. The obsidian blades of the Aztecs are deadly, but would be almost completely ineffective against a heavily armored Spartan hoplite. That being said, if the Spartans could hold out long enough and extend the war over the course of several months, the Aztecs would likely succumb to disease in the same way they had when the Spanish conquistadors swept across Mexico. It's estimated that smallpox killed around 5 to 8 million Aztecs during the Spanish conquest. However, new studies suggest that another disease called enteric fever might have killed as many as 15 million people in Mexico when the Spanish arrived. These were diseases that were brought to the Americas by the Europeans, and since smallpox has been recorded as existing during the time of ancient Egypt, it's likely the Spartans would have had immunity to the disease while it ravaged the Aztec population. So the longer the Spartans could last, the more likely they would have been to defeat the Aztecs. Again, it's important to note that if the two armies had met at their height, the Spartans would have been so greatly outnumbered they would have had eventually succumbed to the Aztec army from just pure exhaustion. However, if the two forces contained the same number of soldiers, there's little doubt the Spartans would have been victorious and slaughtered the entire Aztec force, while only sustaining minimal casualties due to their superior weapons and armor. Both societies placed heavy emphasis on war and trained their children from a young age to be warriors, so it's hard to tell who would win in hand-to-hand combat if an Aztec fought a Spartan without weapons. Archaeological records indicate that Spartan warriors tended to be around 6 feet tall and weigh close to 200 pounds. On the other hand, Aztec warriors were closer to 5.5 feet and weighed around 150 pounds. As such, the Spartans would have had the upper hand in this situation as well. Either way, if the entirety of these two armies were set against each other on a level battlefield with no choke points, an Aztec victory was likely an inevitable outcome. However, if the Spartans were able to use the landscape to negate the Aztec numbers advantage like they did at the hot gates of Thermopylae against the Persians, they would have been victorious. Despite what Gerard Butler's glistening six-pack and billowing cape might indicate in the movie 300, it turns out life as a Spartan warrior was actually kind of terrible. Though life was undoubtedly worse in ancient times on almost all levels, health, longevity, and hygiene, warriors in the ancient Greek city-state of Sparta might have had it worst of all. Why? We sent our reluctant researchers back to ancient times to find out. You might think that hell for Spartan warriors started during the intense military training when they were young men, or perhaps even teenagers, and you'd be wrong. First of all, boys in Sparta were destined to become warriors from the start. No one was asking them about their hopes and dreams or aspirations of starring in Euripides' new play when they were growing up. There was only one permissible occupation, soldier, otherwise known as hoplite in ancient Sparta. This meant that Spartan babies had to prove their fitness right out of the womb. Both boys and girls were inspected for signs of good strength, health, and any physical defects as soon as they were born. A myth persisted for centuries that babies who didn't pass this inspection were tossed into a gorge at the foot of Mount Taygetus. Most historians now believe this to be untrue. Instead, the infants were abandoned on a hillside to die of exposure. So, that's not much better. Occasionally, someone would come by and rescue a baby, but at the end of the day, the point is that the jaundice that kept you in the NICU a bit longer would have been a death sentence in ancient Sparta. The babies that were lucky enough to make it through, and we use that term lucky lightly as there's a whole lot of insanity waiting for them, were bathed in wine to prove that they were in fact strong. That's a lot of strength tests so far for children who cannot walk. When they cried out for attention or to get their needs met, Spartan parents would often ignore their children or purposely put them in dark, isolated spaces so they learned to handle them. We assumed that there was no ancient Spartan version of CPS. After infants had gotten all that pesky teething and learning to walk out of the way, the boys were placed in a strict military educational program at the ripe old age of 7. The program would last a whopping 13 years and was known as agoge. Boys were taken from their families and housed in communal barracks. They were instructed in warfare, hunting, athletics, and more scholastic education such as reading, writing, and poetry. At age 12, when most of us were battling with braces or acne for the first time, Spartan boys had all their clothing taken from them and were forced to sleep outside. They were only handed a red cloak, so it turned out that 300 was accurate in many ways, except that Spartans almost never moved in slow motion. The boys then had to make their beds out of reeds and whatever other material they found in nature. In order to further prepare them for the horrors and scarcities of the battlefield, their elders would encourage them to scavenge for food and steal if necessary. However, if they were caught stealing food, they would be mercilessly flogged or beaten, which is kind of the exact thing the phrase "damned if you do, damned if you don't" was invented for. The point of this, theoretically, as we're making that generous assumption here that the Spartan elders weren't just abusive sociopaths, was to toughen up the boys to withstand the cold, pain, and hunger on the battlefield. However, it wasn't enough to just make them endure such situations. The elders who taught them decided that they needed to instigate further problems as well. Spartan boys in the barracks were often encouraged to fight each other and participate in hazing of their fellow soldiers in training. Apparently, encouraging a spirit of camaraderie wasn't high on the Spartan priority list. Anyone who showed signs of fear or nervousness was especially targeted for ridicule. In fact, occasionally the girls in town who were undergoing their own rigorous training programs at home would sing in choruses at formal ceremonies in front of Spartan elders and dignitaries, and in their songs they would single out boys underperforming in the program to make fun of them. Yeah, imagine that girl you have a crush on in elementary school coming up with a song that she performs in front of the principal and the rest of your classmates about that time you had an accident in first grade and how much of a wuss you are. Oh, and also, you're not in elementary school so much as your life is the Hunger Games. Pretty terrifying, huh? Last of all, before the teens became men, was the diamastigosis. This was also known as the contest of endurance, in which teen boys were taken to the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, placed in front of the altar, and flogged, sometimes to death. Though the practice originated as a religious ritual and a test of the boys' pain tolerance, it eventually became a grisly sport and a kind of tourist attraction. By the 3rd century AD, the town had constructed an amphitheater around the sanctuary so visitors could observe the boys being flogged. So the boys went through their teen years learning that their elders would use pretty much any excuse in the book to abuse them. What happened once they reached the ripe old age of 20 and their primary education finished? Though the toughest part of the training was done, the hardships for a Spartan soldier were far from over once he reached adulthood. When men reached the age of 20, they started attending a type of mess hall known as sousitia. The men were purposefully given bland, flavorless, and small rations so they could learn to cope with hunger. Soldiers were expected to be fully devoted to their physical fitness via training and diet. In fact, any Spartan citizens who were overweight were not only publicly ridiculed, but could even be banished from Sparta for their weight. Basically, imagine if body shaming became a state-sponsored pastime. While the philosophers and artists of Athens would drink wine, eat heartily, and talk about life and culture, Spartan men kept their wine intake to a minimum. They would shame and punish teens for becoming drunk. To show the ill effects of intoxication, they would frequently make the members of the enslaved class, the helots, drink to excess, then parade them around the mess halls. This would be a good time to mention the people who were making Spartan society run while the local Spartan men participated in military training and child abuse. After all, both the Spartan army and the Spartan farms required skilled laborers and craftsmen to be productive. These jobs fell to the perioeci, free non-citizens from the surrounding areas of Laconia. The more labor-intensive jobs were assigned to the helots, a class of enslaved fellow Greeks who made up most of Spartan's population. The helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans, who could become equal citizens, or homoioi. Though the exact numbers vary over time, according to Herodotus in 479 BC, helots outnumbered Spartan men by 7-1. In fact, part of the reason the Spartans kept such a well-trained army is to fend off constant threats of revolts from the helots. Not having an enslaved class in the first place and then not having to abuse your children either might have been the better solution to all this, but what's done is done. The helots unfortunately factor into one of the last components of a Spartan warrior's training as well. After the soldiers entered their 20s, the most skilled among them were organized into Krypteia. Their mentors would give them daggers and a few essential supplies, and they were ordered to roam the roads and countryside day and night to find and murder helots at will. This served the double purpose of preparing the Spartan soldiers to kill others on the battlefield, while also thinning out the helot population so too many of them wouldn't band together and revolt. Though some Athenians and other Greeks criticized the practice as unimaginably cruel, which we would have thought would be self-evident, many Spartans saw it as a noble tradition. Plato described what a Spartan man named Megillus thought of the Krypteia. Krypteia, as it's often called, affords a wonderfully severe training in hardihood, as the men go barefoot in winter and sleep without coverlets and have no attendants, but wait on themselves and rove through the whole countryside both by night and by day. Megillus's description makes it sound like a coming-of-age outdoor adventure rather than the brutal killing spree that it was, which perhaps gives us an idea of how much Spartans accepted violence against the helots. Now that we've seen how Spartan warriors were punished, underfed, abused, left out in the cold, and then asked to become serial killers, let's turn to a subject that might have been a source of happiness for them: love. Hey, life might have sucked in all other respects for a Spartan warrior, but they must have found some solace in their relationships, right? Well, for those in the audience who haven't caught on by now, pretty much every aspect of Spartan warriors' lives was a catch-22 for which they could be punished. See, Spartan men were encouraged to marry in their 20s, so much so that men who hadn't found a wife by their late 20s were ridiculed. After all, the primary goal of the Spartan state was to create a more healthy young soldier, so how could that happen if men and women waited too long to marry? Yet, even though marriage was encouraged, communal living in military barracks didn't end until age 30, when Spartan soldiers were considered full citizens. This meant that though they were usually married for several years before turning 30, they would have to sneak out at night to visit their wives and be intimate with them. Even on their wedding night, Spartan men were expected to be back at the barracks before dawn. This was to further emphasize the point that a Spartan soldier's primary loyalty should be to his city-state, even more so than to his own family. The wedding night itself was incredibly bizarre through our modern lens, or really any lens of any living person at any time. The night of their weddings, wives would shave their heads and dress in a man's cloak and sandals. Not exactly the sexy honeymoon outfit one might think of. They would then be left in either a dark room in their homes or in the husband's barracks, sources mention both, and wait for their new husband to pretend to kidnap them. The marriage would then be presumably consummated once everyone was clearly in the mood from all that incredible head shaving and kidnapping the night provided. Why dress like men and shave their hair, you might wonder? Here is where we get to somewhat controversial part of the history of ancient Sparta. While teenage boys were in the agoge program, they almost always had an older mentor in his 20s training them, educating them, and guiding them into adulthood. There's plenty of evidence that some of those relationships were sexual in nature, though the extent to which this happened is highly debated. Either way, any physical relationship was supposed to stop when a boy became an adult, so the exact opposite of our consent laws today. Some historians have posited that newlywed wives dressed as men in order to help Spartans make the transition from sleeping with men to women. This is contested by others who argue that while Spartan boys did shave their hair in their early teen years, Spartan men took pride in wearing their hair long after that. So the wives shaving their hair for this reason wouldn't make much sense. Any case, throw possible sexual assault into the mix as one of the many things Spartan warriors might have had to deal with. Now, let's say this military training is finally done. A Spartan boy has miraculously made it through multiple tests and abuses he's had to suffer through from birth to age 30. And is now a full citizen of Sparta, with his own home, wife, and land. Surely things must get better from here on out. Well, sorta. Though Spartan soldiers did get farmland that was helpfully maintained by those poor helots, they were on reserve duty as soldiers until age 60. They were even expected to eat meals with their fellow soldiers and spent a lot of time in the barracks, even after they were no longer required to live there. Each Spartan soldier had a bronze helmet, a breastplate, round shield made of bronze and wood, a sword, and a long spear. The shield is important, as it features in perhaps one of the most well-known phrases to come out of Sparta: "Return with your shield or on it." Supposedly, this was what mothers said to their sons before sending them off to war. As usual, Sparta was all about the tough love. In essence, this meant that a Spartan soldier was expected to return victorious and, if not, at least dead or gravely injured. Surrendering during a battle was considered an abject disgrace, and most of the Spartan men who did this either ended up killing themselves or fighting to the death in a later battle to redeem themselves. So, even in adulthood, a Spartan soldier was expected to focus most of his life on fighting, and then expected to either win or die in each battle. Considering how war-prone Spartans were, this didn't bode well for the average soldier's life expectancy. If, and we want to highly emphasize that if, a Spartan soldier made it to the age of 60, he was officially considered retired and would be able to honorably withdraw from the army in any future battles. At this age, he had a chance of joining the Council of Elders, known as the Gerousia, meaning that after a lifetime of abuse, he might spend a couple of years as a politician before dying. That is, assuming he made it to 60 in the first place. Between war, hunger, and disease, this was an unlikely proposition at best.
In the history of human warfare, no warrior has been more celebrated or mythologized than the Spartan soldier. He has stood for millennia as a symbol of unbreakable will and discipline, as a consummate professional whom no hardship could force to betray his loyalty to his comrades or his own personal honor. Frequently, they're depicted in almost cartoonish fashion, as supermen obsessed with war, unbeatable in even combat. The reality is a good deal more complex, but the fact is that Sparta at its prime was an extremely formidable opponent. For a period of more than 150 years, from the 6th to the 4th century BC, no Spartan field army lost a pitched battle, a remarkable battlefield record. For their contemporaries whom they fought against, the Spartans were the epitome of soldierly virtue. How are these soldiers formed? How are they equipped? And how did they fight? A Spartan boy's training began at the age of 7 upon his induction into the famous agoge, the state-mandated educational curriculum for all male citizens. Although the popular image of Spartans is as a bloody-minded, war-obsessed killing machine, in reality the agoge sought to turn young boys into well-rounded, fully formed Spartan citizens. They learned reading and writing, poetry and dancing, hunting and athletics, all the skills befitting the landed gentry they were. All of this was typical of the education of well-born Greeks in other city-states as well. However, the Spartan vision of manly virtue required more than cultural accomplishments. The agoge sought to make Spartan boys extremely tough, capable of bearing hardship and fending for themselves. According to Xenophon, an Athenian soldier and writer whose sons were permitted to attend the agoge, they were fed just the right amount for them to never become sluggish through being too full, while also giving them a taste of what is not to have enough.
Boys were encouraged to steal more food for themselves whenever they could find it. If they were caught, they were brutally whipped to punish them. Not for the theft, but for their clumsiness in allowing themselves to be detected. They slept on beds of reeds pulled from the river with their bare hands, and were given only one new article of clothing each year in the form of a red cloak. They were not only permitted to fight each other, but encouraged to challenge one another to personal combat. The boys were expected to develop a contempt for hardship and suffering, and this mental and physical toughness would serve them well on the campaign. At the age of 18, a Spartan boy became a reserve member of the army, and at 20 he sought to be inducted into one of the public messes, the compulsory communal social and dining groups. He had 10 years in which to try, and only on admittance did he become a full citizen and a regular soldier. Those who failed to be accepted in this time were doomed to only partial citizenship and a life of disgrace. A full Spartan citizen soldier was a heavy infantryman and was equipped as a hoplite, just as the heavy infantry of other Greek city-states. Citizens did not serve as light infantry, and Sparta had to rely on allies and mercenaries to provide cavalry. Hoplites were so called for the large circular shield they carried, the hoplon. Initially constructed of wood, the Spartans began encasing the outsides of their shield in bronze in the 5th century BC. To make them more robust, it was a large, heavy piece of equipment that was essential not only to the safety of the individual soldier, but to that of the man next to him as well. Each man's shield protected the left side of his body, but the right side was protected by the shield of the man adjacent to him in the formation. The shield was also an important symbol of a soldier's courage. If a soldier turned to flee the field of battle, the heavy, cumbersome shield was often one of the first things he jettisoned to enable him to make his escape. Dropping the shield became a synonym for desertion, which would brand any man as a coward. Spartan mothers were supposed to have handed their sons their shields before they left on campaign, with the admonition that they came back with it or on it. In other words, the only options for an honorable man were to carry his shield back successfully, showing that he never broke ranks and fled from battle like a coward, or to be carried on it as a corpse by his comrades. Nothing in between. In the Archaic period, Spartan soldiers wore a bronze cuirass to protect their torsos, but eventually transitioned to the linothorax, a lightweight type of armor made up of layers of linen held together with animal-based glue. It might sound like an unlikely material for armor, but modern reconstructions have shown that the linothorax can offer significant protection against enemy arrows and the slashing attacks of swords. It would not have offered the level of protection bronze did, but it was cheaper, cooler, and importantly much lighter. In the physically demanding environment of battle, men would quickly become exhausted, and weight had to be saved where it could. The soldier would have been further protected by bronze greaves to guard his lower legs and a bronze helmet. The most iconic image of the Spartan warrior has him wielding a Corinthian-style helmet, which covered most of his face, with its distinctive angular eye slits and nose and cheek guards. A bright crest of horsehair was worn on top, making the wearer appear larger and more intimidating. Over time, however, the helmets of Spartan soldiers evolved, and later generations wore the pylos-style helmet, which was shaped like a rounded cone. The pylos didn't protect the wearer as completely, but it was lighter weight and allowed the wearer a greater field of vision and better hearing, an important feature in the roaring chaos of battle. The Spartan hoplite's main weapon was the dory, a single-handed spear ranging from around 7 to 10 feet in length, made of cornel or ash wood, with an iron spearhead at the top and an iron butt spike at the bottom to balance the weapon. The bottom spike could be used to anchor the spear in the ground and even to kill wounded enemy soldiers lying on the ground as the formation moved over them. The spear was essential to the Greek style of fighting, allowing a soldier to strike out at an enemy while maintaining his place in a tight formation, and for multiple ranks of men in the formation to fight. Each soldier would also carry a javelin to throw at the enemy and a short sword called a chiphos. It was to be expected that as the two battle lines closed on each other and the fighting began, many spears would be broken in combat or unusable at close quarters. Then the soldier could draw his sword to continue the fight. The Spartan short sword was noted to be considerably shorter than those carried by the soldiers of other Greek states, which might have made them more useful in the close press of battle, where there would be no room to wield a longer blade. In one story, a Spartan mother, hearing her son complaining that his sword was too short, admonished him to step a foot closer to the enemy and it'll be long enough. Each man wore a red cloak called a himation, and a formation of Spartan soldiers would have presented an uncommonly unified appearance compared to their contemporaries. By the late 5th century BC, the Spartans were painting their shields with the famous lambda symbol, the Greek letter L, which stood for the proper name of the Spartan state as a whole, Lacedaemon. In other Greek armies, a soldier's shield would have been painted with the design of his own choice. Xenophon described the Spartans' appearance on the field of battle as a single mass of bronze and red. The Spartan infantry fought in the same manner as that of other Greek city-states, in the hoplite phalanx. The phalanx was a dense formation of spearmen positioned so closely together that each man's shield overlapped the right side of the man next to him, with the spears of the first few ranks projecting forward. The result was a solid block of men, extremely strong and resistant to breaches by the enemy, bristling with spears all along its front. Men behind the front rank could add their force to the advance by pushing on the man in front of them, creating a terrible momentum that made the phalanx extremely difficult to stop or break. When warring Greek city-states met on a field of battle, the opposing phalanxes would line up opposite one another and advance to contact. They would thrust, stab, hack, and push until one side's formation came apart or the men lost their nerve and broke. If one side's phalanx maintained its courage, discipline, and cohesion longer than the other, they could drive the enemy before them, giving them no choice but to retreat. Then cavalry could ride them down and slaughter the fleeing soldiers. The phalanx did, however, have serious weaknesses. First and foremost, it was an extremely slow and cumbersome formation. The strength of the phalanx relied on the soldiers remaining closely packed together, which meant that it had to advance very slowly. Phalanxes had a notable tendency to drift to the right as they moved forward, as each man sought to remain in the protection of the shield of his neighbor. Rough terrain could cause dangerous gaps to open up in the formation, and so hoplite armies tended to choose flat, open terrain for battle. Even more importantly, the phalanx was inflexible and difficult to control, with thousands of men packed into a tight group, each man relying on the proximity of his neighbor for protection and trying to never open up a gap for the enemy to exploit. It could not maneuver easily. Once the opposing phalanxes were lined up for battle, it was extremely difficult to do anything but move straight forward. The armies of the Greek city-states were not made up of what we would think of today as professional soldiers. These were not men who made a career fighting, but citizens called away from their normal lives to serve for a brief time against a particular enemy. Most Greek armies did not practice formation drills, which meant that complicated maneuvers on the battlefield were simply beyond their capabilities. The Spartans were an exception. Spartan soldiers regularly practiced maneuvering together in formation, relying on their greater discipline to keep ranks. Moreover, unlike the rest of the Greeks, their command structure included officers at much lower levels of organization, which made it easier for orders to be passed down the chain of command. The result was that Spartan phalanxes could accomplish what their enemies could not, wheeling and repositioning the formation on the field of battle, even with the enemy line bearing down on them. If this sort of maneuver was pulled off successfully and well-timed, it could potentially be a battle-winning tactic in itself. At the Battle of Nemea in 394 BC, the Spartans and their allies fought a coalition of Thebans, Athenians, Argives, and others. The Spartans, as always, took up the position of honor on the rightmost flank of their line. Both sides formed their phalanxes and advanced to battle, and as often happened, both lines drifted toward their right sides. The Spartan phalanx defeated the Athenian forces opposite them, and then, keeping good order, managed to wheel their formation of approximately 6,000 men to take the rest of the coalition forces in the flank. They rolled up the enemy line, inflicting nearly 3 times as many casualties as they themselves suffered. It was not the individual fighting prowess of the soldiers that allowed Sparta to become the dominant military power of their heyday, but the greater discipline, organization, and control they achieved. The result was a fearsome record of victories unmatched by any other Greek state. For a period of more than 150 years, no Spartan field army would be defeated in pitched battle, though there would be minor setbacks in small engagements and irregular warfare. In the end, Sparta's reputation for invincibility would be shattered by the Thebans at the battles of Tegea, Leuctra, and Second Mantinea, but by that time the Spartan legend was fully formed. In over 2,000 years, no other soldier has been able to compete with the reputation of the Spartan hoplite for mastery of battle and complete, unwavering dedication to the warrior ethos. It's 2 a.m. on May 19, 1941. Under the cover of darkness, the mighty battleship Bismarck slips free of her moorings and heads out to sea. The ship is impressive, largest in the entire German fleet, with a displacement of over 50,000 tons, packing 64 guns, with foot-thick armor protecting her from enemy fire. She's headed for the Danish Straits, where she'll be joined by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen and her 3 destroyer escort. Overhead, the fearsome Luftwaffe provides air cover, watching over the convoy of ships until they're out of range.
Their mission is to slip past British defenses and make for open water in the Atlantic, where they will raid Allied shipping and cripple Britain's ability to continue its war effort. A few days later, though, the German convoy encounters the Swedish cruiser Gotland. Sweden is a neutral nation, and thus the Germans aren't concerned about being attacked by Swedish coastal defenses. But unbeknownst to the Germans, the captain of the Swedish ship radios a report back to naval headquarters, which is passed along to the British naval attaché to Sweden by Swedish officers with sympathies to England. Royal Navy Captain Henry Denham immediately transmits the information to the British Admiralty, who review a report by Allied codebreakers that a raid on the Atlantic was imminent, and realize this is the flotilla en route to wreak hell on British shipping. A pair of submarine Spitfires are quickly ordered into the air over the Norwegian coast to search for the German ships. They must be found immediately, and the ships of convoy, to include the mighty Bismarck, must be sunk at all costs. The very fate of Britain hangs in the balance. The now legendary Bismarck had her keel laid on the 1st of July 1936 in Hamburg, Germany. She was to be a replacement for the old pre-dreadnought SMS Hanover and a counter to the French Richelieu class of battleships. Though on paper she was within the 35,000-ton limit imposed by international treaty that governed battleship construction in the period between World War I and World War II. In reality, she far exceeded those limits, though by the time she was completed, the treaty system had fallen apart due to Japan's withdrawal and was not enforced. She would come to displace over 50,000 tons and measure 823 feet, immediately becoming the largest battleship in Europe until the commissioning of the HMS Vanguard by Britain after the end of the war. Her complement included 1,962 enlisted men, overseen by 103 officers, and she could carry 4 Ahado float planes for scouting and spotting fire. She had a cruising range of 8,870 nautical miles and could move along at 19 knots, putting much of the Atlantic at risk for the Allies. One of the most formidable ships ever built at the time, the Bismarck sported 8 15-inch guns, arranged in 4 twin-gun turrets, with 2 stationed forward and 2 aft. Her secondary armament was made up of 12 5.9-inch guns, 16 4.1-inch guns, and 16 1.5-inch guns, and 12 anti-aircraft guns. Her sides were protected by a belt of armor a foot thick, and her upper and main decks were armored with 2 inches and 3.9 to 4.7 inches of armor plating, respectively. Not only could the Bismarck dish out one hell of a pounding, she could take it in return and keep on firing. On the 5th of May 1941, the Bismarck is ordered on a mission to raid Atlantic shipping. German U-boats had been very successful to date, but the British had begun moving their merchant ships in large convoy fleets protected by destroyers and small aircraft carriers. The losses against German U-boats were growing exponentially, but with the Bismarck and her destroyers to support them, the Germans could wreak havoc on British shipping, potentially even ending the war by forcing Britain's surrender. 11 days later, the Bismarck leaves her port in Poland and makes for the Danish Straits, where she's joined by the Prince Eugen and 3 destroyers, along with a small flotilla of minesweepers. The German mission is so secret that even its crew is unaware of their destination or assignment, and it isn't until noon on May 20th that the crew is told over loudspeaker of the ship's mission. At about the same time, though, a group of Swedish aircraft flying reconnaissance comes across the German fleet, radioing their composition and heading, while remaining unseen by the Germans. 1 hour later, the Swedish cruiser Gotland intercepts the fleet and shadows it for 2 hours as it passes by Swedish territorial waters. The Germans are unconcerned by the Swedish ship, though. Privately, Captain Ernst Lindemann, commanding officer of the Bismarck, fumes that operational secrecy was effectively lost. The Swedes may be neutral, but any stray radio chatter reporting their position could be picked up by Allied spies, and the Germans always suspected that the Swedes harbored many Allied sympathies and could simply give up the ship to the British. Captain Lindemann orders the convoy to increase speed and get out into open water as fast as possible. The quicker they reach the Atlantic, the safer they will be. Back at the British Embassy in Sweden, Captain Henry Denham receives an urgent report by a Swedish officer with sympathies to the Allies, exactly as feared by the Germans. Though the Bismarck is not named in the report, what is clear is that a large German force is making for open water, and there can only be 2 conclusions. The Germans are preparing for a cross-channel invasion of England, or they're moving forces out into the Atlantic in order to cut Britain off from America and the vital war supplies the US is providing. Either possibility spells disaster, and Captain Denham immediately contacts the British Admiralty with this information.
Back in England, an intelligence officer confirms that his codebreakers at Bletchley Park had decrypted reports that the Bismarck and Prinz Eugen had taken on prize crews of sailors meant to take over damaged enemy ships and sail them back to friendly waters for repairs, and that their captains had requested additional navigational charts. This could only mean one thing: the long-awaited German push into the Atlantic was finally coming, and leading the offensive was the most feared battleship in Europe. A pair of submarine Spitfires are immediately ordered into the air to search for the German flotilla off the coast of Norway, while at the same time the Germans launched their own aerial reconnaissance mission over the British naval base at Scapa Flow. The Germans discovered that 1 aircraft carrier, 3 battleships, and 4 cruisers are still anchored at Scapa Flow, which confirms their belief that the British are unaware of the Bismarck and her battle group's mission. That night, the Bismarck reaches the Norwegian coast, where her minesweepers, 2 raiders, and their destroyer escorts break off and continue north without her. The next morning, the Prinz Eugen intercepts radio broadcasts ordering British recon aircraft to search for 2 battleships and 3 destroyers northbound off the Norwegian coast, and at 0700 hours, the Germans spot 4 unidentified aircraft believed to be British planes, which immediately depart the area. Shortly after noon, the German destroyers, minesweepers, and raiders reach Bergen and anchor at Grimstadfjord. The Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen, meanwhile, are taking on supplies and fuel, while a pair of Luftwaffe Bf-109 fighters fly overhead to provide air cover. Despite the air cover, though, British flying officer Michael Suckling fires his Spitfire directly over the German flotilla at a height of 26,000 feet and takes photos of the Bismarck anchored alongside her remaining escorts. Managing to break away from the defending German fighters, Suckling makes it back to base, where the pictures are immediately analyzed and a report sent directly to the Admiralty. The British battlecruiser HMS Hood, the battleship Prince of Wales, and 6 destroyers are ordered to reinforce a lone pair of cruisers that are currently the only force patrolling the Denmark Strait. Meanwhile, the British home fleet is put on high alert in Scapa Flow and puts out to sea. The greatest naval battle of the European theater is in the making, with the fate of Britain in the balance. The British immediately dispatch 18 bombers to attack the anchored ships, though as luck would have it, the weather over the fjord where the ships are sheltering worsens considerably, and the bombers are unable to locate the German fleet. The next day at 1930 hours, the Bismarck, Prinz Eugen, and their 3 destroyer escorts all leave Bergen and put out to sea once more. And it wouldn't be until midnight, when the force was already well out to sea, that Hitler is informed of the raid on the Atlantic. By this time, it has become clear to the German senior command staff that Hitler was no master strategist, despite his proclivity for personally overseeing every aspect of the war effort. Thus, the choice had been made to not let the Führer know of the Bismarck's mission until it was far too late for him to stop it. Thus, grudgingly, Hitler consents, and the Bismarck continues on her way. The next day, at 0410 hours, the 3 escorting destroyers are detached from the fleet as the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen attempt to dash through the Denmark Strait and break out into the open Atlantic. Speed is increased to 27 knots and both ships' radars are activated, potentially giving them away to Allied forces, but also allowing them to monitor any threats bearing down on them. The move is risky, but mists have reduced visibility to between 3,000 and 4,000 meters, which suits the Germans as it provides them with cover from air attack, but could also give that same cover to British ships lying in wait to ambush the 2 German vessels. The mood is tense aboard the Bismarck. If they can break past Iceland, they'll be out into the open Atlantic and safe from British attack. But they're so close to Britain now that any moment these mists could be hiding a British fleet waiting to pounce. At 1000 hours, the Germans encounter ice floes, which force them to reduce speed and adopt a zigzag route through the dangerous icebergs. This further slows their breakout to the North Atlantic. At 1922, hydrophone and radar operators raise the alarm after detecting the HMS Suffolk at a range of approximately 12,500 meters, and the Prinz Eugen's radio intercept team confirms their worst fears. Their location has been reported. The Prinz Eugen is immediately ordered to engage the Suffolk, but through the fog, the Germans are unable to clearly make out their target. Rather than light themselves up and give the British an easier target to spot and fire back at, the Germans hold their fire, while the Suffolk retreats to a safe distance, continuing to shadow the German ships. At 20:30 hours, the heavy cruiser HMS Norfolk joins the Suffolk, but strays too close to the Germans, who immediately open fire. The Bismarck fires 5 salvos from her main gun, 3 of which score hits on the Norfolk, but cause superficial damage. The Norfolk responds by laying down a smoke screen and fleeing into a fog bank to lick its wounds. The opening salvo of Europe's greatest naval battle has officially been fired.
The concussion from the big guns of the Bismarck, though, have knocked out her radar set, and the Prinz Eugen is ordered to take points so she can use her own radar to find the British formation, hoping to surprise the British ships shadowing them. The Germans wait until the Bismarck has been overtaken by a rain squall and then put the ship through a 180-degree turn, steaming full speed ahead at the two British ships. The surprise attack, however, is defeated by the Suffolk's radar, which easily detects the Bismarck's maneuver despite its heavy rain cover, and the British ships evade the pending attack. The British cruisers remain on station throughout the night, continually relaying the German position to the rest of the British fleet. The Germans know a fight is coming and try to get what rest they can through the stormy weather. The weather finally breaks early on the morning of the 24th of May as hydrophone operators aboard the Prinz Eugen detect a pair of unidentified vessels approaching at high speed. A half hour later, the German lookouts spot smoke on the horizon, and a few minutes later, the ships are revealed to be the Hood and Prince of Wales. Alarms ring and claxons sound as the men rush to battle stations, the Bismarck training her big guns on the approaching targets. At 05:52 hours, the Hood opens fire at extreme range, and a salvo of shells explodes in the water around the Prinz Eugen, which the British have mistaken for the Bismarck. The Prince of Wales responds a minute later, firing her own salvo at the Bismarck, though its shells too fall short of their mark. As the British ships approach, they continue raining down fire on the Germans, though the Germans don't respond. Inside the bridge of the Bismarck, 1st Gunnery Officer Adalbert Schneider requests permission to return fire twice, but is denied twice by Admiral Gunther Lütjens, Fleet Chief of the Kriegsmarine. After a few close calls, Captain Lindemann can no longer bear it and mutters, "I will not let my ship be shot out from under my ass," and formally requests permission to return fire from Lütjens, who at last relents. The British ships are approaching head-on, which only lets them use their forward guns. The Germans, meanwhile, are able to bring all of their guns to bear on the British and fire full broadsides. British Vice Admiral Holland orders his ships to turn 20 degrees to port, allowing them to close the distance to the Germans while bringing their rear gun turrets into the fight. Rather than spit their fire like the British, the Germans concentrate their fire on the Hood, and almost immediately after being free to return fire, the Prinz Eugen scores a direct hit with a high explosive shell, starting a large fire. British damage control crews rush to put out a fire that threatens ammo stores and manages to put out the flames before the entire ship goes up in one giant explosion. Unfortunately for the British, though, the Germans have found their range to the Hood, and the Bismarck immediately opens fire with rapid salvos from its main guns. Its secondary guns are ordered to engage the Prince of Wales, scoring 1 or 2 hits with fail to penetrate her heavy armor plating. The Prinz Eugen is then ordered to shift her fire onto the Prince of Wales in order to keep both enemy vessels under fire, and a few minutes later the Prinz Eugen scores 2 direct hits on the British ship, which set off several small fires. The Prinz Eugen then drops behind the Bismarck so that she can use her radar to monitor the location of the Norfolk and Suffolk, which have been shadowing the battle. At 0600 hours, the Bismarck scores a direct hit on the Hood with an armor-piercing shell, which penetrates deep into the bowels of the ship and detonates 112 tons of explosives stored below. A massive explosion immediately breaks the back of the Hood, splitting her into 2 pieces. The battle for the Atlantic has only lasted 8 minutes so far, and already the British have lost 1 ship and 1,419 men. The Bismarck immediately shifts her fire to the Prince of Wales. The British ship is now outnumbered 2-1, and the Bismarck manages to score a direct hit with its first salvo, striking the bridge. The round does not explode on impact, but instead passes through the bridge and out the other side, though it kills everyone inside save for Captain John Leach and 1 other officer. Hurt and limping, the Prince of Wales nonetheless returns fire and scores several direct hits on the Bismarck, hitting her on the forecastle and above the torpedo bulkhead and flooding a turbo generator room. A 3rd round passed straight through a lifeboat and the float plane catapult, though it too fails to explode on impact. By 0613, most of the Prince of Wales guns are out of commission, and she's taken very heavy damage. Captain Leach orders the ship to retreat, and she immediately lays out a smoke screen to cover her withdrawal, with the Germans firing the entire way until at last she's out of range. Aboard the Bismarck, Captain Lindemann insists on giving chase and finishing off the heavily wounded British battleship, but Admiral Lütjens refuses and quotes operational orders that state the ships must not actively engage any forces not protecting a convoy. At
first, the Bismarck doesn't seem to be seriously damaged, but after the Prinz Eugen spots heavy streams of oil on both sides of her wake, the Bismarck is ordered to make for Saint-Nazaire in occupied France for repair. The Prinz Eugen is ordered to detach and commence its attacks on Allied shipping, leaving the Bismarck to steam back to port alone. The Prince of Wales, meanwhile, has joined the Suffolk and Norfolk, which are still shadowing the Germans, though it's ordered to the rear of the formation, given her extensive battle damage. A British flying boat spots the oil slick being left behind by the Bismarck and reports it to the British ships, who report it back to the British Admiralty. Seeing a chance to destroy Germany's most powerful ship, the British order all available ships to give chase, and in total 6 battleships and battle cruisers, 2 aircraft carriers, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers all begin the hunt for the Bismarck. At 1814 hours, the Bismarck suddenly turns on the 3 British ships and opens fire. The Suffolk, well out of range of its smaller guns, breaks away at higher speeds, though the Prince of Wales, which has repaired 9 of its 10 damaged guns, fires 12 salvos in response. No hits land on either side, though the brief action diverts the British attention and allows the Prinz Eugen to finally break away and head out to the Atlantic. With the Eugen away, the Bismarck turns back and resumes its course to port. She's been damaged and slowed, but it's still steaming along at 28 knots, the maximum speed of the chasing British ships. If she can't be slowed down, the British won't be able to stop her from reaching port, and once under cover from the Luftwaffe, any attempt to sink her would be suicidal. In desperation, the British launch a nighttime strike from the nearby aircraft carrier Victorious, which launches 6 fighters and 9 torpedo bombers. As they approach their target, though, the inexperienced air crews almost attack the Norfolk and a U.S. Coast Guard cutter by accident, and the confusion alerts the Germans to their approach. As the torpedo bombers finally spot the correct target, the Bismarck lowers her guns to maximum depression and opens fire, creating huge splashes in the water path of the incoming bombers, which must fly low in order to release the torpedoes. None of the aircraft are hit, but only 9 of the torpedoes finds its mark, striking amidships along the armored belt that protects the ship. The damage is light, but the stress of evading the incoming torpedoes has caused flooding from the forward shell hole scored earlier by the Prince of Wales. The flooding forces the crew to abandon the port number 2 boiler room and slows the Bismarck down to a speed of 16 knots. By morning of the 25th of May, though, the damage has been largely repaired by damage control crews, and the Bismarck is once more able to steam along at 28 knots. Entering waters known to be prowled by German U-boats, the British are forced to zigzag in order to avoid the lurking threats, which further adds to the Bismarck's growing lead. Successfully breaking radar contact, the Bismarck circles away to the west and then the north, confusing the British, who by this point are low on fuel and desperate to make contact again. Unaware that she has successfully shaken off her pursuers, though, the Bismarck sends a radio message to Naval Group in West Paris, asking for Luftwaffe air support. British codebreakers decrypt the messages and successfully triangulate the location of the Bismarck, though a mistake by the pursuing British puts them on the wrong course for 7 hours, adding even more distance to the Bismarck's lead. The British immediately order every available ship and plane to search for the Bismarck. It's not until 10:30 on the 26th of May that she's spotted again by the U.S. Navy pilot north of Brest. If the Bismarck isn't stopped soon, she'll be in range of friendly U-boats and the Luftwaffe in less than 1 day. Yet most of the British forces were not close enough to stop her. The only possibility to stop the Bismarck lay with the Royal Navy's Ark Royal, a small aircraft carrier equipped with antiquated Swordfish torpedo bomber biplanes. The odds couldn't have been longer, but the chance to sink Germany's most powerful ship and break the back of the German Navy would quickly pass, and so the Swordfish are ordered into the air. Armed with magnetic detonator torpedoes, the Swordfish proceed on a bearing to the Bismarck, but instead encounter the heavy cruiser Sheffield, which has been ordered to shadow the Bismarck, though the pilots were never told. Believing they were at their target, the Swordfish proceed to attack the Sheffield, though the magnetic detonators on the torpedoes fail, and the Sheffield is unscathed. Returning to the Ark, the Swordfish are rearmed with contact detonator torpedoes. At 19:10 hours, the flight of 15 Swordfish take to the air, and at 20:47, the attack on the Bismarck begins. Plunging through the growing cloud cover, the small biplanes are raked with anti-aircraft fire, even as the Bismarck fires its main guns on the Sheffield, which is moved into range hoping for a critical hit from a torpedo attack. The first few salvos manage to score hits on the Sheffield, though, and the cruiser is forced to retreat under a cover of smoke. The torpedo bombers meanwhile avoid incoming anti-aircraft fire and loose their torpedoes against the Bismarck, which is by now zigzagging violently to avoid the attack. Torpedo after torpedo misses the giant ship, until finally 2 manage to hit. The first doing minor structural damage, but the second explodes on the Bismarck's stern, near the port rudder shaft. The rudder becomes locked in a 12-degree turn, and the Bismarck is no longer able to sail straight, instead sailing in large circles, utterly helpless versus approaching British forces. Whether miracle or luck, the antiquated biplane torpedo bombers have managed to do what the most modern British ships couldn't, and now the Bismarck's fate is sealed. Aboard the Bismarck, Admiral Lutchen sends a radio dispatch to fleet headquarters at 2140. The message simply reads, "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." Her crew, fully cognizant of their fate, grow increasingly depressed, yet remain committed to fight to the last. At 2238, a group of 5 British destroyers encounter the Bismarck, only to be greeted with heavy fire from her main guns. The Polish destroyer ORP Piorin takes a direct hit, yet continues to close defiantly until a near miss at 12,000 meters forces her to turn away. Stuck making slow circles, the Bismarck is unable to maneuver, and throughout the night the British destroyers dart in and out, harassing her with fire until daybreak. At sunrise, the British battleship King George V leads the final attack on the Bismarck. Within minutes, the King George is exchanging fire with the Bismarck, its big 16-inch guns raining fire down around her. For her part though, the Bismarck immediately scores several hits on the British destroyer Rodney, though the increasingly heavy seas and her inability to steer is making it difficult to aim her guns properly. Closing in, the attacking ship's secondary batteries open fire, joining their 8-inch guns to the fight. At 0902 hours, a 16-inch shell from the Rodney strikes the Bismarck's forward superstructure, immediately killing hundreds of men and severely damaging the 2 forward turrets. Captain Lindemann and Admiral Lutjens, along with the rest of the bridge staff, are instantly killed. The Bismarck is now without a captain and with her 2 main guns severely damaged. Moments later, another salvo strikes the forward main battery, and it's unable to fire again, save for one final salvo at 0927 hours. By 0931, all 4 main batteries are severely damaged and out of action, smoke and fire pouring over her deck. By 1000 hours, the British are at point-blank range and have fired over 700 shells. The Bismarck has been reduced to a mangled, smoking mess of steel wreckage, yet the British continue firing. They've been ordered not to stop until the ship strikes her colors or lowers her flag in surrender. It becomes clear that the men are abandoning ship. Orders are given by the surviving officers to scuttle the Bismarck, and scuttling charges are planted in the depths of her hull. By 1020 hours, the British have now fired over 2,800 shells at the Bismarck, most at close range, and yet still failed to sink her. With British ships running low on fuel, the cruiser Dorsetshire is ordered to sink the Bismarck with torpedoes, and the rest of the ships are sent back to port. The Dorsetshire scores 2 direct hits with its torpedoes on the Bismarck's starboard side, and 2 more hits on its port side, and at last the incredible ship slips beneath the waves. Out of a crew of over 2,200 men, only 114 would survive, but the Bismarck itself would endure as a testament to German engineering and combat prowess. Struck over 700 times, it took 4 direct hits by torpedoes at close range to at last send the mighty ship to the bottom. And after such a staggering combat action, it becomes clear why the British feared what would happen if the Bismarck had ever made it to the open Atlantic and been let loose upon their merchant shipping fleet. It's October 25, 1944, and off the coast of the Philippine island of Leyte, American battleships are trading blows with the remnants of the Japanese fleet. Cruisers and destroyers cut through the waters at high speeds, laying withering barrages against each side's most vulnerable ships. In the air, fighters screen the skies from opposing dive bombers and torpedo planes. Japanese naval aviation has been decimated by a year and a half of fierce combat across the Pacific, and now its surviving pilots are inexperienced raw recruits thrown into the teeth of American aces. For Japan, the battle is dire. If it loses, the Americans and their Australian allies will sever Japan's supply lines and cut off its access to oil it so desperately needs to keep its ships at sea. For the US and Australia, a defeat of the Japanese here means the protracted war will be cut dramatically short, potentially leading to victory in just a few months. Both sides know that the outcome of the war hangs on a knife's edge and are throwing everything they have at each other in what will become the greatest naval battle in history. Between August 1942 and 1944, the Americans have pushed the Japanese steadily back across the Pacific. Their losses in Pearl Harbor have been quickly replaced, the full might of the American economy turning to a wartime footing. In June of 1944, the Americans launched an invasion of the Mariana Islands, with the Japanese counterattacking in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, resulting in a disastrous defeat of the Japanese Imperial Navy, which cost it 600 aircraft and the loss of 3 of their remaining aircraft carriers. This defeat has left Japan with virtually no naval air power and struggling to replace its losses with inexperienced pilots, fresh from a training program which has been slashed in half. America, on the other hand, has started rotating its combat pilots back to the States, where they do short tours as combat instructors, giving new American airmen an unparalleled training advantage compared with their Japanese counterparts. The seizing of the Mariana Islands has penetrated Japan's inner defense ring and made the mainland vulnerable to long-range attack by B-29 Super Fortress bombers. America's next move is now carefully being calculated, with Admiral Ernest J. King, supported by members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, advocating for a blockade of Japanese forces in the Philippines and focusing on an attack on Taiwan in order to give the US and Australia control of the sea trade routes between Japan and southern Asia. The plan is solid, and with Japanese forces blockaded in the Philippines, they'll be unable to resupply and eventually, perhaps in a few months, forced to surrender. Any attempts by the Japanese to break out of their besieged forces will end in disaster, and they'll be sailing straight into the teeth of a combined US-Australian naval task force supported by air power from surrounding islands. The seizing of Taiwan will also give the US a second launching off point for air attacks against the Japanese mainland and allow medium-range bombers to join in the strikes. Yet General MacArthur disagrees with this plan, partly because he sees leaving the Philippines in Japanese hands a blow to American prestige, and because it would be a personal affront to the man who claimed in 1942, "I shall return," after his forced retreat. The general also highlights the considerable land-based air power that Japan has amassed in the Philippines, a threat significant enough that it's considered too dangerous to ignore by many high-ranking officers outside of the Joint Chiefs, to include Admiral Chester Nimitz. Eventually, President Roosevelt lends his support to taking back the Philippines, and thus the greatest naval battle in history is set into motion. General MacArthur and his forces would invade the island of Leyte in the central Philippines, with close naval support provided by the 7th Fleet, which was at the time made up of both American and Australian units. The U.S. 3rd Fleet, commanded by Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., would provide long-range cover for the invasion. From the onset, the plan held a critical flaw. No single American officer would be in command of the overall attack, a flaw which, combined with the failures in communication, would result in a crisis and nearly a complete strategic disaster for the US. The Japanese, who by pure coincidence also lacked an overall commander, drew up 4 victory plans in response to the obvious pending invasion. The plans, however, all called for Japan to commit almost all of its forces in response to any single attack, falling within the lines of Japanese wartime strategy of seeking the decisive battle, a strategy which had failed them repeatedly throughout the war in the Pacific. Most of the times that the Japanese had overcommitted their forces and attempted to force a decisive battle against the US fleets, the Americans had simply withdrawn. The US could afford to replace its losses and oil supplies, while Japan could not. Hence the Japanese' desperate attempts to force one single decisive battle that would cripple the Americans for good. It's early in the morning on October 12th, and Admiral Halsey has ordered the launching of massive airstrikes against the Formosa and Ryukyu Islands. American dive bombers climb through a sky filled with enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, struggling to deliver their payloads against the Japanese airfields. All around them, American Wildcat fighters scream through the sky, goading what's left of Japan's air power into a fight and protecting their bomber escorts. Japan's naval air power may have been severely diminished, but its land-based forces have long been itching for a fight versus the American aviators that have scored such catastrophic losses against their fleets. From sunup to sundown, waves of fighters and bombers swarm the skies above Japanese airfields. The Japanese try to retaliate by targeting the American carriers, but are intercepted by American fighters. After 4 days of non-stop air battle, the Japanese have lost hundreds of fighters and bombers, and their airfields and support facilities have been taken out of commission. The Americans, meanwhile, have lost only 89 aircraft and suffered 1 light cruiser damaged, with 1 heavy cruiser seriously damaged and in need of repairs. The battle over Formosa has been a stunning American success and has taken Japanese air power out of the equation for the invasion of Leyte. In response to the pending American invasion, Japan orders a force of 5 battleships, 10 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 15 destroyers to set sail from Brunei to the Philippines. Squarely in their path, though, are the American submarines Darter and Dace, which at 0:16 hours on October 23rd make radar contact with the incoming Japanese, while they wait on the surface. Facing off against a force of 32 combat ships, the 2 submarines decide to engage anyways, knowing that this fleet could inflict serious damage to the rest of the American forces. The Darter shoots off 3 contact reports to the rest of the US Navy, one of which is intercepted by a radio operator on Yamato. But Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita orders no anti-submarine action, believing an attack on his superior forces to be too suicidal for the Americans to consider. Unbeknownst to the Admiral, that's exactly what the Americans are considering though, and the 2 submarines steam at full speed for several hours to get ahead of the Japanese ships. Submerged and lying in wait, the Japanese sail straight into the planned ambush, still taking no anti-submarine actions to protect themselves. At 0524 hours, Darter fires a rapid-fire salvo of 6 torpedoes, and hydrophone operators aboard the heavy cruiser Atago raise the alarm, but too late. Explosions rack the heavy cruiser as 4 torpedoes score a direct hit. The fleet now scrambles, Admiral Kurita incredulous that a single American submarine would dare to threaten his fleet. 10 minutes later, the Darter lines up for a firing solution on the heavy cruiser Takeo, scoring 2 more hits. The Japanese fleet begins dropping depth charges at random, hydrophone operators unable to pinpoint the American submarine, and at times getting what they believe to be false positives from locations the attacking submarine could not possibly be at. At 0556 hours, Dace breaks its cover and fires a spread of torpedoes that score 4 hits on the heavy cruiser Maya, and the Japanese realize that they're not dealing with 1 sub, but 2. The Atago and Maya have taken catastrophic damage and quickly sink. The Takeo is so damaged that her seaworthiness is in question. After being rescued from the water, Admiral Kurita orders the Takeo to retreat back to Brunei, escorted by 2 destroyers. The rest of the fleet is on high alert, and the American subs are in serious danger of being blown out of the water if they remain. So instead, they break off their attack and follow the Takeo, hoping for a chance to finish her off. 3 of Japan's most formidable ships have been knocked out of the fight, and her sailors rattled by the seeming impunity with which American submarines attack them from out of the deep. On the 24th of October, Admiral Kurita's forces continue toward the Philippines, where it makes contact with the U.S. 3rd Fleet. Despite being superior in firepower, the 3rd Fleet is missing 2 of its carrier groups, which had been detached and sent to provision and rearm. As the Darter's contact report comes in, Admiral Halsey recalls one of the groups, but lets the other continue on its resupply mission. This leaves the Americans with only 60% of their air power. To support the incoming Japanese fleet, aircraft based off of Luzon are dispatched against the American carriers. 3 waves of 50 to 60 aircraft scream toward the American carriers, but long-range radar has warned them of the threat. Combat air patrols made up of Hellcats rise up to meet the incoming attack, and the majority are shot down or driven off in fierce fighting. Only a single Japanese aircraft carrying an armor-piercing bomb penetrates the heavy air cover, and at 938 hours, the light carrier USS Princeton is struck. The resulting explosion knocks out her emergency sprinklers and fire spreads throughout the ship. The light cruiser Birmingham pulls up alongside her to assist in the firefighting, when suddenly a massive explosion rocks the Princeton, killing 233 sailors. Alongside her, the Birmingham is so badly damaged that the ship is forced to retire, her crew transferred to another vessel. The Princeton is a total loss, but the Americans have decimated the Japanese aircraft, further clearing the skies of hostile fighters and bombers. An hour and a half after the Japanese launched their attack, the Americans launched their own against the Japanese fleet. The battleships Nagato, Yamato, and Musashi are struck, along with the heavy cruiser Myoko, which is forced to retreat. The Musashi is hit another 10 times in the subsequent wave, and Admiral Kurita orders his fleet to retreat in order to get out of the range of the aircraft. Later that night, and under the cover of darkness, he orders the fleet to turn back around. The Musashi has been sunk and the Myoko crippled, but the rest of the fleet is still battle-worthy. Meanwhile, the Japanese Northern Force, made up of a large formation of Japan's remaining carriers, steams south toward the Americans. The move is a feint, however, and the carriers are only lightly armed and have about 100 aircraft between them. They're bait for the Americans to engage and thus pull their battleships and other defensive vessels from the San Bernardino Strait, which will leave the amphibious this landing force vulnerable to Admiral Kurita's forces? The Americans suspect that the Northern force is a feint, but a series of bad radio communications and poorly worded orders have sown confusion amongst the American commanders. Without a single unifying leader to command the entire operation, Admiral Halsey takes 3 of his carrier groups north to chase down the Japanese carriers. This leaves the American landing vessels completely unprotected from Admiral Kurita's battleships, except for a single escort carrier group. With the landing forces vulnerable, Japan's southern force attempts to link up with Admiral Kurita's ships, but to do that, it must sail through the narrow Surigao Strait. Yet, as the fleet enters the strait at 0300 hours on the 25th, it runs directly into an American trap set by the US's 7th Fleet Support Force. Scores of PT boats swarm the Japanese ship, loosing torpedoes at close range, though miraculously, not a single one manages to land a hit. Yet, as the fleet pushes back through the strait, it runs straight into the American battle line, and its 2 battleships are struck by torpedoes from American destroyers. The Yamashiro is able to power through the ambush, but the Fuso is badly hit and sinks 40 minutes later. 2 of the Japanese destroyers are also immediately sunk, and a third forced to retreat only to sink later. The rest of the fleet tries to escape the deadly ambush, but waiting past the destroyers are 6 American battleships. The Japanese are decimated, and with a single salvo of 12 14-inch shells, the Mississippi fires off the last battleship-to-battleship attack in history, closing a chapter in naval warfare forever. At the same time, Admiral Kurita's force has sailed through the San Bernardino Strait, completely unopposed. The American carriers and battleships meant to defend the landing craft off on a wild goose chase for the Japanese northern force. Now a force of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers steam down on a small force of American escort carriers, protected by destroyer escorts and light destroyers, catching them completely by surprise. Yet Admiral Kurita is unaware that the northern force has successfully lured away the bulk of the US fleet. Strict radio silence does not allow the 3 fleets to coordinate with each other. Thus, he orders his ships into an anti-aircraft formation in order to defend against an overwhelming air attack he believes is coming. It's only a half hour later that he realizes that the force he is facing is not the feared 3rd Fleet, and immediately orders a general attack. This sows confusion among the Japanese ships, who must now break their formation and link up for an independent division attack. Closest to the enemy, the destroyer USS Johnston, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Ernest E. Evans, is first to respond. He sees the situation before him and knows that the landing vessels are doomed if the Japanese break through. On his own initiative, he steers his ship directly into the Japanese formation at top speed, firing her torpedoes and scoring direct hits on the heavy cruiser Kumano, which is forced to drop out of the fight. Upon seeing the reckless charge by the Johnston, the order is given for the rest of the American destroyers and destroyer escorts to attack. Hopelessly outgunned and dwarfed by the mighty battleships and heavy cruisers, the smaller American ships nonetheless take the Johnston's lead and sail straight into the teeth of the Japanese fleet. The Americans swarm the Japanese, who are not expecting this suicidal rush and are forced to drop out of their formations in order to avoid the spreads of torpedoes coming their way. Getting into knife fight range, the small American vessels are savaged by Japanese fire, but the determined ships manage to sow major confusion and seriously damage several of the larger Japanese ships. The escort carriers meanwhile launch every available plane, armed with anything that they can carry. The carriers know they're in a fight for their lives, and the planes are launched with nothing more than depth charges and machine guns if need be, as escort carriers are primarily armed for long-range recon and anti-submarine warfare, and are lacking the anti-shipping munitions carried by the larger main carriers. Yet, because the Japanese have no air cover, 450 American planes swarm the Japanese ships. Even inadequately armed as they are, they manage to cause serious damage to several vessels. Believing that he's facing the main American fleet due to the ferocity of the attack, instead of just a lightly armed escort group, Admiral Kurita orders a general retreat for his forces. Incredibly, the Japanese thus pass up their opportunity to seize victory and score catastrophic losses on the poorly defended troop transports. Kurita would go on to regroup his forces, but ultimately the Battle of Leyte Gulf is won here, and the Japanese defeat is ensured. Had Kurita correctly ascertained that he was facing no more than a light escort group, the US and Australian invasion force would have been decimated with severe loss of life, and Japan's sea trade routes would have remained open. With this withdrawal, however, Kurita had ensured that Japan's critical link to its oil supplies is forever severed, and a total defeat is inevitable. The end of America's war in Vietnam saw a US military in crisis, its morale all but depleted and its combat experience watered down by massive conscription. In the years that followed, the Pentagon focused on restoring America's military by returning to an all-volunteer force and addressing the problems of systemic drug abuse and a weak officer and non-commissioned officer corps. But just how well would America's military fare in a new conflict after years of neglect and waste? 20 years after Vietnam, the world would get to find out, as America's forces were immediately thrown into the last of the greatest tank battles of the 20th century. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographic Show. Today we're taking a look at the Battle of 73 Easting and how America proved once more it was a force to be reckoned with. The First Gulf War, or Operation Desert Shield and later Desert Storm, was the last major war of the 20th century. Fought between Iraq and a coalition of over 30 nations, it was ultimately a test not just of America's post-Vietnam War military, but of the UN as a world peacekeeping organization. With a potential to escalate to an all-out regional conflict between Arab states, failure to contain Iraq's hostility would have signaled to the world that even after decades of work, the UN was just as a lame duck at global peacekeeping as the League of Nations before it. But how did the war start? Iraq's belligerence towards Kuwait started toward the end of the Iran-Iraq War, a brutal conflict that lasted for 8 years. During the conflict, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia had backed Iraq financially, lending it billions of dollars. After the war, Iraq complained to the Arab League that its debts should be forgiven, as it had acted in the foreign policy interests of both Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, who feared a growth of Iranian Shia influence amongst their own Shia populations. Iraq also raised concerns that both nations were producing more oil than the agreed-upon OPEC production limits, which was lowering the price of oil and costing Iraq billions. Lastly, Iraq specifically leveled charges against Kuwait that it was exploiting Iraqi natural resources by slant drilling across its northern border into Iraq's Rumelia oil field, in essence drilling diagonally to bypass national borders underground. If you've seen There Will Be Blood, it's the milkshake scene. Iraq did not like Kuwait drinking its milkshake one bit, and after the Arab League refused to act, Iraq, prompted by those and other grievances, launched a ground invasion of Kuwait, annexing the nation as a province of Iraq. For its part, the United States had long tried to broker a settlement in the region, but when Iraq linked its grievances with enforcing a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the U.S. refused to negotiate. Yet the United States remained reluctant to commit to military force, and ultimately it was Great Britain's Margaret Thatcher who reminded U.S. President George Bush Sr. about the consequences of inaction during Germany's hostilities prior to World War II, most famously by telling the U.S. president not to go wobbly. Wobbly President Bush would not go, and he immediately demanded an exit from Kuwait by Iraq. With Iraq poised to invade Saudi Arabia and seize control of over 65% of the world's oil-producing fields, the US and other allied nations had pre-deployed several 100,000 troops to Saudi Arabia as part of Operation Desert Shield. On the eve of war, these troops were reinforced with detachments from many NATO and non-NATO nations, including several Arab League nations, which President Bush had insisted on joining so the conflict would not be seen purely as West versus Arab. When Iraq refused to withdraw from Kuwait, the U.S. launched Operation Desert Storm on the 17th of January 1991, and the Battle of 73 Easting, the last great tank battle of the 20th century, soon followed. So who were the combatants, and what weapons was each side bringing to the fight? On the defending side was Iraq's fearsome Republican Guard, with the best training and equipment available to the Iraqi forces. The Republican Guard had been a force to be reckoned with during the Iran-Iraq War, responsible for some of Iraq's greatest victories. It was these elite soldiers who were dispatched to be the first to meet the American advance, and American war planners had estimated that defeating the Republican Guard forces would be a costly victory, even weakened as they were by weeks of aerial bombardment. The Republican Guard brought the vaunted Soviet-built T-72 main battle tank to the battle. A stalwart of Soviet design philosophy, the T-72 brought few innovations but was a solidly built and capable tank. With a 125mm cannon, one 7.62mm and one 12.7mm machine gun. The T-72 may have been nearly 2 decades old, but it was still a formidable threat. Its cannon had exceptional accuracy and firing rate both, with up to 8 rounds a minute or 1.2 rounds if loaded manually, and an armor penetration of 590 to 630 millimeters at 2,000 meters. On the defensive, a T-72's frontal armor was 200 millimeters thick and capable of stopping a direct hit from an M1 Abrams from 2,000 meters away. The T-72's greatest weakness, however, was its lack of thermal vision systems and very poor night vision capabilities, which were a crippling deficiency in combat. Supporting its T-72 tanks were mechanized infantry deployed in Soviet-built BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicles, equipped with a 73mm semi-automatic cannon and a 7.2mm coaxial machine gun. BMPs not only protected squads of soldiers that rode inside of them, but were capable of taking on lightly armored vehicles themselves. Iraq's Republican Guard BMPs were also equipped with 9M14 and 9M113 Conquer's anti-tank wire-guided missiles, making them an agile threat to American tanks. Its 33mm thick armor plating provided protection from 7.62 armor-piercing rounds, and in a limited degree of fire, even 50 caliber machine gun fire. Like the T-72, however, Iraq's BMPs lacked thermal imaging capabilities or capable night vision sight factors, which would be decisive throughout the Gulf War. Facing off against Iraq's fearsome Republican Guard were elements of the U.S. Army's 7 Corps, to include the 1st through 3rd Armored Divisions and the 1st Infantry Division. Having seen no major action since the end of the Vietnam War, America's newly reminted all-volunteer army had some serious proving to do. Yet the U.S. Army had spent the last 2 decades drilling out its conscript force and restoring the capabilities and expertise of its leadership at the non-commissioned and commissioned levels, as well as engaging in routine exercises with NATO partners to stop a Soviet incursion through the Fulda Gap. The 7 Corps brought to bear the now legendary but as of then untested M1A2 Abrams. Designed in response to Soviet deployments of new main battle tanks, the M1A2 hosted a slew of revolutionary features, most notable of all being its Chobham armor, of which it was the first tank deployed which incorporated it. Still a classified secret, Chobham armor is a composite armor made up of steel plates layered with ceramic inserts and empty spaces meant to defeat anti-tank missiles and rounds by deflecting or redirecting explosive blasts and kinetic penetrators. It also featured layers of depleted uranium armor, making it one of the toughest fighting vehicles ever created. Its 120mm cannon is paired with a fire control computer which aids a gunner by calculating lead angle, ammunition type, and range to a target, a feature missing from Iraq's T-72s. The M1A2 also featured thermal and night vision imaging, as well as laser rangefinders, all features that would prove decisive in the deserts of Iraq. The 7 Corps infantry were supported by M2 Bradley fighting vehicles, armed with a 25mm automatic cannon with a firing rate of up to 300 rounds a minute, and a tow missile launcher. M2s were heads and shoulders above Iraq's BMPs in capabilities. Its aluminum armor is reinforced with laminate belts and steel skirts capable of stopping up to 50 caliber rounds, and even offering some protection from long-range tank fire. M2s are equipped with both thermal and night vision imaging, once more granting them a major advantage over Iraq's BMPs. In total, American forces numbered at around 4,000 versus the Republican Guard's 2,500 to 3,000 personnel. Yet with well-prepared defenses and boasting the 4th most powerful military in the world at the time, the advantage was with Iraqi forces, and American military planners expected heavy casualties in the ensuing action. The battle. On the 23rd of February, American forces swept into southern Iraq. A frontal push by armor was coordinated with a sweeping hook meant to encircle Iraqi forces from behind and attack from their flanks. The initial action saw stunning American victories, with 55 Iraqi tanks and 45 armored vehicles destroyed, along with hundreds of enemy KIA and the surrender of 865 prisoners. The next day, elements of the 7 Corps swept into northern Kuwait to sever Iraqi lines of communication and block the retreat of Iraqi forces. Another 50 enemy vehicles were destroyed, along with 1,700 prisoners captured. Moving to block further American advances and to secure their supply routes, Republican Guard forces took up positions along roadways, expecting an American attack to come along major roads, as they did not think anyone would be able to navigate the featureless desert. Unfortunately for Iraq, American forces were equipped with GPS, at the time a relatively new feature on armored vehicles, which allowed them to surprise Iraqi forces from unexpected avenues of attack, originating deep in the desert. On the 26th of February, 7 Corps' 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was ordered to advance up to 70 Easting, an eastward measured distance designated by GPS, and engage the Republican Guard without becoming decisively engaged, so they could retain their maneuverability. At 16:07 p.m., E Troop of the 2 ACR, equipped with 9 Abrams, 12 Bradley fighting vehicles, and 220mm mortars, made first contact with the enemy. The main Republican Guard force had been entrenched near a village on the other side of a small rise in the terrain, in a reverse slope defense. Unaware of American GPS and expecting an attack to come along the main road, the Iraqi commander had dug in his 40 T-72s and 16 BMPs 1,000 yards from the ridge and created 2 engagement areas on the east side of the ridge and north and south of the village. He had also deployed several minefields which included both anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, and supported his armor with hundreds of infantry in hardened bunkers and trenches. A reserve force of 18 T-72s and more BMPs was held near his command post about 3,000 yards east. American forces arrived from out of the desert, not along the road as expected, catching the Iraqis completely by surprise. Destroying a bunker serving as an observation post by running over it, E Troop's lead Bradley took 2 surrendering enemy soldiers prisoner. A second Bradley came under fire from Iraqi forces trying to reposition inside the village, and 9 Abrams returned fire with high explosive rounds. Given the clear to advance, E Troop reoriented so that its Abrams would lead the charge, with its Bradleys falling back to provide support. Cresting the rise north of the village, the Abrams made immediate contact with the T-72s entrenched there. Weather had been poor all day and visibility was very low, yet the Abrams were able to clearly see and target their T-72 opponents via their thermal sights, and with superior fire control and precision, eliminated all 8 T-72s they encountered in under a minute. Advancing past the wrecked tanks, E Troop immediately came under fire from more tanks, BMPs, and hundreds of infantry, all trying to reposition to meet the American attack. It was at this point that the E Troop had reached their limit of advance, 70 Easting, which they had been ordered not to exceed, with further orders to not become decisively engaged. This point in the battle, perhaps more so than the superior performance of American vehicles, proved to be decisive, as the commander of the E Troop, then Captain, today National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, disobeyed orders and commanded his troops to press the attack. This may seem like a court-martial-worthy offense, and certainly in many of the world's militaries it would be, except the US military has for a long time embraced a doctrine of flexibility, which not only allows but encourages its junior officers to execute orders as they see fit. Recognizing the high-speed pace of modern war and acknowledging the often superior situational awareness of junior commanders, who are often on the front lines, the U.S. military encourages its junior officers to take the initiative. This makes U.S. forces extremely flexible and is often a deciding factor in modern combat. Iraqi forces, on the other hand, operated by a heavy-handed top-down command structure that severely limited individual officers' abilities to react to quickly changing situations. This Soviet-style command structure was most notably evident during the coalition's air war, during which US-led airstrikes severed communication links in Iraq's extremely robust air defense forces and rendered them extremely ineffective. At 70 Easting that day, this difference between command styles and military doctrines would prove to be as decisive a force as the mighty Abrams. E Troop continued its advance toward the next ridgeline at the 73 Easting, on which were positioned the reserve force of 18 T-72 tanks. Still waiting for orders from their commander, the T-72s were caught completely unprepared, and the first of their numbers were destroyed from a range of about 1,000 yards. The rest of the vehicles attempted to mobilize and exit the staging area, but American Abrams quickly crested the ridge and destroyed all of them at close range. Now occupying the high ground that the Iraqi forces had planned on using to dominate the Americans, E Troop consolidated its position, but came under attack by a company-sized force of T-72s and BMPs. The Abrams, backed up by Bradley's firing TOW missiles, made quick work of the enemy force before they could close, eliminating the entire counterattack from long range. Meanwhile, E-Troops mortars suppressed enemy infantry, trying to mass further east, while artillery fire support rained down on other enemy positions. The Battle of 73 Easting lasted just over 23 minutes and resulted in an absolutely lopsided victory for American forces. Americans suffered 6 KIA and 19 wounded in bunker clearing operations by their infantry and 1 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. Iraqi forces suffered between 600 to 1,000 KIA and WIA, 1,300 prisoners taken, lost 160 tanks, 180 personnel carriers, 12 heavy artillery pieces, and several anti-aircraft artillery repositioned to serve as ground fire support. The battle proved the superiority of the Abrams tank design and the effectiveness of its classified Shabam armor, which had not seen combat yet. Despite taking numerous direct hits from T-72s, not a single American Abrams was rendered inoperable or required major repairs. In fact, the only Abrams to be lost during the entire Gulf War would be to friendly fire. The battle also proved the effectiveness of other as-of-yet unbattle-tested systems, such as military GPS and new-generation thermal and night vision equipment. It proved the technological edge of American forces and ensured that all tanks built worldwide would include thermal and night vision equipment as a mandatory feature. The Battle of 73 Easting also proved the superiority of American military doctrine over Soviet doctrine. E-Troops' quick thinking and disobeying of previous orders had seized the advantage and prevented Iraqi forces from recognizing and mounting an effective counterattack. Catching the Iraqis deployed to fight along the wrong axis of battle had given American forces an insurmountable advantage. Iraqi positions simply could not have defeated the surprise attack, deployed defensively as they were. But had E-Troop obeyed orders and not advanced past the 70 Easting, those same forces could have repositioned and regrouped, presenting a much more formidable challenge that could have seen them inflict more serious casualties on the Americans. The Battle of 73 Easting would have major repercussions around the world, with more militaries adopting a less centralized command structure, though traditionally conservative nations such as Russia and China still struggle to lend their junior officers the flexibility that is so obviously critical to success on the fast-paced modern battlefield. The battle and stunning outcome of American advances against Iraqi forces, who were at the time the world's 4th most formidable military, along with the results achieved by American weapons and equipment, also led Soviet observers at the time to declare that the only way to stop an American armored advance would be to use tactical nuclear weapons. It also proved that the decay of America's military brought on by the Vietnam War had been fully reversed, and that it now fielded a professional and competent military that persists to this day. It's mid-December 1944, and Allied troops have crossed over into West Germany. In the east, most of the hard-won gains of the German army against the Soviet communists have been lost, and now a furiously vengeful Red Army bears down on Germany. The nation is facing war on 2 fronts and is losing on both counts. In his command headquarters, Hitler stews and fumes, blaming his generals, the troops, the equipment, everything and everyone but himself, despite the fact that he personally oversaw and planned many of the major offenses against the Allies. Hitler needs a miracle to save himself, and as he inspects the battle lines drawn out on a giant tactical map before him, he thinks he sees one. He stabs a finger down on the Ardennes Forest, disputed territory that lies between the German and Allied forces. His generals raise skeptical eyebrows. The forest is very difficult terrain for the mechanized armies of the Wehrmacht to cross. And yet, years before, at the glorious onset of what was at the time a highly successful and victorious war, they had done just that, completely taking the French and British by surprise and rendering the formidable French Maginot Line series of fortifications completely useless. It worked once, it'll work again, and despite the protests of his generals, Hitler orders the attack. His plan is simple. He'll surprise the Allied forces and split them in 2 by cutting through the Ardennes and deep into their lines. Once split, the Germans will hook north and seize Amsterdam and Antwerp, denying the Allies the use of their port facilities to land more troops and supplies closer to the front lines. and more importantly, keeping Allied air power at bay. In a stunningly bold masterstroke, Hitler planned to crush the Allied offensive on the Western Front and perhaps convince the demoralized Allies to join him in combating the Communists, whom most of the world already held in deep suspicion. The plan was ambitious, and if it worked, it could have indeed set the Allies back months, giving Germany a chance to negotiate a ceasefire and push the Soviets back. Germany may not be able to retake the lost territories in France, but it could hold Poland and focus its efforts on the Soviet Union, at last crushing the Red Army and bringing Stalin to heel. It could work, and if it did, it would swing not just the course of the war, but history itself. Yet Hitler could never plan on the grit, resolve, and determination of America's 101st Airborne, who would hold against incredible odds and keep the Germans from securing their final victory. Working under a veil of extreme secrecy, the Germans began to organize for the pending attack under the codename of Operation Watch on the Rhine, a purposefully defensive-sounding name, which they hoped would fool Allied spies into believing the Germans were simply preparing for their defense of the Rhine River. Under the guise of defensive operations, the Germans gathered a force of 200,000 men, 1,000 tanks, 1,900 artillery pieces, all supported by 2,000 fighter aircraft. They would be facing off against 80,000 Allied troops with less than 250 pieces of armor and 400 artillery guns. Most of the troops directly in Hitler's way were American, and of them, the majority were still inexperienced, while the Germans fielded a great number of battle-hardened veterans, though they had supplemented their ranks with boys and men who would have previously been considered too young or too old for military service. The Germans would also be bringing to bear the mighty 70-ton Tiger II tanks, absolute monsters with no equal on the European battlefield. These tanks could score kills on Allied armor at incredible ranges and were so well protected that they could take several direct hits in return with little damage. In the air, the Germans also featured the new Messerschmitt Me-262 fighter jets, which dramatically outperformed any Allied fighter in the skies. Fortunately for the Allies, numbers of both Tiger II and Messerschmitts were limited, but where they were applied would dominate the battlefield. On December 16th at 0530 hours, 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire, raining down destruction for an hour and a half across an 80-mile front opposite the 6th Panzer Army. The American forces weathering the storm believed this to be an expected and localized counterattack in response to their recent attack in the Wallerscheid sector in the north, where the U.S.'s 2nd Division had destroyed a large portion of the Germans' defensive Siegfried Line. As heavy snowstorms blasted the area, both Allied and German aircraft were grounded, but the snow did not stop the rumbling advance of heavy German armor. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army attacked toward Bastogne and St. Vith, critical road junctions that must be seized in order for the offensive to be successful. In the south, the 7th Army pushed into Luxembourg in order to secure the attacked flanks versus Allied counterattacks. If the southern push failed, the flank of the German offensive would be exposed and vulnerable to counterattacks that could sever supply lines and isolate German forces in the same way they planned to do to the Americans and British. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army, best equipped of all German armies, cut straight toward its chief objective, Antwerp, and its port facilities. It's the opening day of the assault, and American forces have been taken completely by surprise. The initial push has seen major retreats by American infantry, but after the initial shock wears off, the Americans dig their heels in and repel the Germans. For their part, the Germans are now focusing their efforts on taking the critical Lausanne Road, a route through the Lausanne Gap which must be secured in order to transport the rest of the offensive to its ultimate objective in Antwerp. But American engineers have beaten the Germans to the punch and blown up 2 key overpasses, leaving the Germans with no option but to reroute their forces through the small village of Lanzarote. 22 Americans hold Lanzarote at the moment. 18 of them form an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, and 4 of them are forward air controllers, tasked with calling in air support where needed. This small village, normally relatively strategically unimportant, has suddenly become the most important objective in the German campaign, and this small force of 22 U.S. soldiers is all that stands between Antwerp and the full might of the 6th Panzer Army. Early in the morning of the 16th, as the Germans launch their offensive, 55 soldiers from the 820th Tank Destroyer Battalion, help securing Lanzarote, are ordered to reinforce U.S. troops in battle near Buchholz Station. Their withdrawal has left the 22 Americans alone, and with no armor support. First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, in command of the American defenders, orders 3 of his men to set up an observation post in a house on the east side of the village, and as he accompanies them, he spots a column of 500 German soldiers advancing toward them. From their distinctive helmet style, Bouck immediately realizes that these soldiers are Fallschirmjäger, some of the best soldiers in the German army. Most of his troops, meanwhile, are raw recruits with a few seasoned veterans amongst them. They are all expert marksmen though, and in top physical condition, hand-picked for their assignment. They were supposed to be operating behind enemy lines, capturing enemy soldiers for intel, and fixing enemy positions. What they were not supposed to be doing was securing an entire village against a force 20 times their size. Bouck radios HQ for permission to organize a retreat in force, fighting a delaying action that would let his men retreat while putting up a fight that would slow the Germans down. The request is denied, however. The sudden offensive has taken the Americans by surprise, and the loss of the blown-up overpasses has made Lanzarote critical to the German plans. It must be held at all costs. Bouck is promised reinforcements and told to hold. The Germans stroll into town with weapons slung, not expecting any American resistance in this sector, a fact that Bouck takes to full advantage as he organizes a brutal ambush on the unsuspecting Germans. The fighting quickly becomes house to house, and despite being hugely outnumbered, Bouck's men are scoring massive casualties on the Germans. The Germans may have brought their best, but the Americans are crack shots and have the advantage of being on the defensive. Still, the battle is clearly suicidal, and desperately Bouck calls for reinforcements and artillery support. He's told that none is available, and yet he must hold at all costs. This means hold until dead or captured, the village must not fall. With grim resolve, the Americans hold their ground, exacting a heavy toll on the advancing Germans. After 20 hours of constant fighting, the Americans are finally forced to surrender, but not before inflicting 92 casualties while suffering 15 of their own. Lieutenant Bouck is shipped off to a POW camp believing he has failed, and won't learn until the end of the war that his heroic stand was likely responsible for foiling the entire German northern advance. The 20-hour delay has halted the whole of the German 6th Army advance, creating a massive bottleneck that buys time for the American defenders to reorganize and counterattack. Improved weather opens up the skies for Allied aircraft, which savage German panzers, and the northern attack fails. While the advances in the north and the south were facing considerable resistance and slowly being ground to a halt, the advance in the center is a considerable success. The 5th Panzer Army, spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer Division, swings south of Bastogne and crosses the Orth River, though a lack of fuel briefly halts its advance. The Germans are cutting deep into the Allied lines, and back in Berlin there's much celebration. Despite the failures in the north and south, the Allies may still have their forces split, and if that happens, the Germans may be victorious yet. There's just one tiny problem: the town of Bastogne, a critical junction for the German advance, is still being held by America's 101st Airborne. All 7 roads that traverse the dense Ardennes forest converge on Bastogne, and if Antwerp and its harbor are going to be taken, Bastogne must fall first. Failing here means the Allies will be able to bring their air power closer to the front lines and begin landing troops and supplies close to the front. Bastogne has to fall, no matter the cost. In the small village, a few thousand American airborne troops are being supplemented by a small force of light and medium tanks and 3 artillery battalions. The American armor has taken a savage beating, and the remnants are organized into a mobile fire brigade of 40 tanks. The surviving artillery numbers at 36 guns, but ammunition is dangerously low. In command of the Americans is Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, and having received the news that the Germans have pushed the Allies back on both his north and south, he knows that he's standing alone and reinforcements aren't coming. He also knows that if Bastogne falls, the German offensive through the Ardennes will break upon the retreating Allied forces with devastating results. The general assigns his men defensive positions to the east, north, and south, and orders the remaining tanks to form a mobile fire brigade responsible for responding to any armor spearheads by the Germans. At his disposal is the 36 artillery, but their ammo is running low, so its use will have to be sparing, and only when most needed. Most German tanks will have to be dealt with by the infantry, using their portable bazookas and grenades if need be. The worst winter storm in memory has struck the area as well, so resupply by air or tactical air support will not be available. the Americans are alone and facing a force of over 54,000 Germans. Early on the 20th of December, the Germans launched probing attacks against the encircled Americans against their southern and western defensive perimeters. The one advantage the Americans have is that being surrounded, the armor doesn't have to travel far to reposition against each German attack. When the infantry is in danger of being overrun by German tanks, the American armor disengages from one battle and rushes to the other. Their artillery is also able to rapidly retreat, and barrages of fire are brought down on each subsequent German attack. The Germans find no weak spots in the American defense and suffer serious casualties for the attempt. Still, the Americans are low on ammunition and the weather has kept resupply planes at bay. It's only a matter of time before they are annihilated. And on the 22nd, the German commander sends a letter to General McAuliffe. In it, he reminds the general that he is completely surrounded and that the fortune of war is changing. He informs the general that more German armor has already crossed the river outside Bastogne and is ready to join the fight. If he doesn't surrender his troops, they will be met with total annihilation. General McAuliffe carefully reads the letter, then picking up a blank sheet of paper, he scribbles a quick response before handing it to the German messenger. Back behind friendly lines, the messenger delivers the response to the German commander, who opens it to read, "To the German commander, nuts, the American commander." On Christmas Day, the Germans make good on their threats and assault Bastogne in force. The night before, the Luftwaffe had carried out a bombing attack, which killed 21, but the Americans are still holding fast. The German commander concentrates his forces on one spot, rather than attack from all sides, and the 47th Panzer Corps smashes into the Americans on their western perimeter, rather than the south where expected. The initial fighting sees the Americans pushed back all the way to their command posts, but then they dig in and hold out against several infantry assaults. The panzers that formed the original assault split into two columns to encircle and try to reach the American command post from the rear, but they're met by the remaining American armor, and 4 tank destroyers are completely obliterated. The German assault has failed, and within days the Allies have regrouped from the massive German offensive and retaken the lost territory. The defenders out at Bastogne are relieved and hailed as heroes, but theirs is a story that is played out dozens of times across dozens of different flashpoints by the British and American soldiers, who refuse to yield under the weight of the crushing German advance. Peace at last is on the horizon, as well as the fall of one of the most murderous regimes of the 20th century. 500 pro-Syrian government troops led by a detachment of Wagner PMC fighters versus 40 American special forces and a handful of their Syrian rebel allies. But not only was no American even wounded, the opposing force was utterly devastated, and we have Russia to thank? The conflict in Syria has been raging for years, with the United States of America and the Russian Federation both supporting opposing sides. The US and its coalition partners support the Syrian Democratic Forces, a group of rebels from varying groups who all have one goal: overthrow the government of Bashar al-Assad and bring him to justice for his many crimes against humanity. The Russian Federation naturally supports Assad's dictatorship, if for nothing else than because Assad has made it clear that the Russian Navy will maintain access to the Mediterranean via leased naval facilities on Syria's coast. The opportunity to commit wanton war crimes is just a plus for Russian troops. Both sides have been careful to steer clear of each other's military forces. When Syrian Democratic Forces captured Raqqa from ISIL in 2017, the Euphrates River became a de facto border between US-backed rebels and the Russian-backed Syrian government. A deconfliction line was set up between US and Russia to ensure that neither side accidentally engaged each other's forces, especially vital due to heavy presence of air power on the US side and ground-based air defenses on the Russian side. While the Russian aerospace forces provide air support, Russia's main tool on the ground is the Wagner Group, the now infamous shadowy PMC, which acts like an extension of the Russian government, or at least it used to in the good old days before Prigozhin tried to march on Moscow before changing his mind. Back then at least, Wagner acted in unison with the Russian government's wishes, giving the Kremlin plausible deniability as its operatives inflicted mayhem across the Middle East and Africa. The Euphrates had served as a tentative border between pro-government and rebel forces, but the Syrian government had managed to secure a small salient across the river. The US and Russia both agreed that no more than 400 troops could be stationed in that salient at any one time, and while Syria nor Iranian-backed militias were party to this agreement, the Syrian government needed Russian support bad enough to agree to those terms by proxy. The troop limit was meant to prevent a sudden offensive by pro-government forces, which otherwise would have to cross the river, giving rebel forces ample time to mount a defense. Details of what happened next remain murky, but a narrative can be pieced together from various sources. While disregarding the more outlandish claims out there, What we do know is the rebel forces held very profitable oil facilities near the Euphrates, and in past conflicts, Wagner PMC has often been compensated by being granted a share in liberated, a term we use extremely loosely here, mining and oil extracting or processing facilities. Several days before the infamous attack, U.S. intelligence intercepted communications between Wagner's chief Yevgeny Prigozhin and senior Syrian officials as well as Kremlin officials. The intercepted communications painted a picture of the Kremlin and the Syrian government giving Prigozhin the green light to go ahead with a, quote, fast and strong operation sometime in early February. The only problem for both the Syrian government and Prigozhin's ambitions was a detachment of U.S. special forces based near the lucrative oil facilities that Prigozhin hoped to seize. Wagner nor the Russian government could launch an all-out attack that couldn't be traced directly back to them, so days before the battle, U.S. intelligence began to note the arrival of dozens of fighters just across the Euphrates. U.S. officials quickly notified their Russian counterparts about this massing of troops, but the Russians claimed they had no control over local fighters. This would fly in the face of intercepted radio communications in Russian coming from the massing troops. Officially, the Russians claimed that the gathering force were Syrian government soldiers and members of various militias fighting on their own initiative. However, U.S. intelligence was extremely confident that a significant number of the fighters assembling in the area were Wagner military contractors. As the force began to move out at around 3 p.m. local time, it was clear it was making its way to a Conoco gas plant near the city of Deir al-Zur. Right in the force's way was a headquarters manned by between 30 to 40 U.S. Delta Force soldiers and rangers, alongside a few Kurdish and Arab allies. If the Wagner-led force was going to capture the Conoco plant, it would have to go straight through the Americans. Watching via drone feeds, the tiny American-led force was not just outnumbered 10-1, but the Syrian force were advancing with 27 armored vehicles, including several tanks. U.S. forces on the ground had nothing that could stop a tank. About 20 miles away, Green Berets and a platoon of Marine infantry also watched the advancing force via drone feed, waiting for the call to roll out. They were equipped with Stryker armored vehicles, but could bring man-portable weapons to bear on the Syrian tanks. Even if the Marines and Green Berets got there in time, they would still be significantly outnumbered and outgunned in raw firepower. Also monitoring the situation was the American Air Operations Center at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which immediately placed all available air assets on alert. Nobody could be sure the Wagner-led Syrian force was truly aiming for a fight. It wouldn't be the first time that they'd attempted to intimidate the U.S. or its allies into concessions. However, the previously intercepted communications made the Americans wary that this was the big move Prigozhin had been asking for permission to make, and the formation's movement toward the Conoco plant seemed to back the suspicion up. As evening began to fall, it was clear that the Syrian formation was making its move. At the mission support site 20 miles away from the U.S. Delta Force and the Rangers, Marines scrambled into 4 Strykers to be ready to provide support if needed. They were still only 16 strong, but the Strykers could deliver a world of pain on their own with great precision. Their equipment was far superior to anything the Syrians or even Wagner forces had on hand, with extra Javelin anti-tank missiles tossed into the vehicles alongside thermal optics and extra food and water. Everyone involved expected a significant and protracted battle to come, but the order to move out hadn't been issued yet. At 8:30 p.m., the spearhead of the enemy formation had made it to a mile from the plant. Led by 3 T-72 tanks, the U.S. forces at the Conoco plant had nothing to match that level of firepower, but the tanks had stopped, and there was hope that the ensuing battle could be averted. Secretly, though, more tanks and vehicles gathered in nearby neighborhoods, using the buildings as cover to remain unseen. U.S. drones, though, watched their every move. Even so, the quick reaction force of Marines had not been dispatched, the Pentagon hoping that a conflict could be avoided. Then suddenly, all hell broke loose. Long-range artillery began to open up on the American position, supplemented by much closer mortars. The T-72s also opened up with their main guns, while armored vehicles strafed with their cannons and heavy machine guns. The fire was largely inaccurate, but dangerous in volume. U.S. forces and their partners ran for cover behind dirt berms, preparing to use their small store of anti-tank missiles on the advancing vehicles. However, the U.S. still attempted to avoid an all-out confrontation. Very confident Russian Wagner mercenaries were amongst enemy troops. The last thing the Trump administration wanted was an accidental war with Russia. For 15 minutes after the attack began, U.S. officials repeatedly called their Russian counterparts, asking them to recall the attacking force. However, Russian officials repeatedly denied knowledge of the attack, claiming that the gathered forces were Syrian volunteers and government troops that they had no control over. The quick reaction force was already on its way though, but driving on very rough roads and with their headlights off to avoid being targeted. Instead, they relied on night vision and thermal cameras, making an already slow drive even slower. With U.S. troops under fire and the Russians refusing to cease the attack, Secretary of Defense Jim Mathis turned to General Joseph F. Dunford Jr., chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Deep inside the belly of the Pentagon, they watched via live drone feeds the advancing forces who were now starting to become dangerously accurate with their fire as they drew closer. Secretary of Defense Mathis then gave a simple command: annihilate them. Within seconds, the Secretary of Defense's order had reached American commanders in the region. At the Conoco plant, the Rangers and Green Berets had already expended their small supply of anti-tank weapons. This had knocked several of the armored vehicles out of the fight, but just under 24 more continued to advance, albeit a hell of a lot more cautiously now. The Russians had gotten their first taste of the Javelin, before being served a 3-course meal in Ukraine years later. But U.S. forces were entirely outmanned, and enemy artillery was making it difficult to engage approaching troops. Within minutes of General Mattis's order, the U.S. Air Force began to bring the pain. First to strike were armed drones, the same ones currently overwatching the conflict, but these drones had very limited munitions and could do little to impact the fighting on the ground. Additional Reaper drones began to arrive, carrying out precision strikes against enemy artillery and mortar positions. Next came the waves of American fighters. F-22 Raptors had already been sent near the fighting. Russian air defenses extended well over this part of Syria, and the U.S. could not know how Russia would react once it began to launch a full-scale air operation. The Raptors therefore had been sent to ensure Russian fighters did not interfere, but with none on the horizon, they were turned loose on the ground forces below. F-15 Strike Eagles were hot on their heels, delivering punishing precision strikes against artillery and mortar positions. At around 11:30 p.m., the quick reaction force of Marines had reached the fighting, but forced to hang back due to the heavy artillery. Their own vehicles would be made mincemeat by the enemy tanks and the heavier infantry fighting vehicles, so the Marines were forced to sit back and wait, but they wouldn't have to wait long. Marine rocket artillery based dozens of miles away had been feeding precision rockets into the fight with the aid of drones, striking at enemy artillery. Not long after, a flight of Apache helicopters came screaming out of the horizon, delivering a withering barrage of missiles and rockets to the advancing tanks and armored vehicles. A Russian survivor would later describe the American Apaches as whirling carousels of heavy machine gun and cannon fire as the armored helicopters strafed across the advancing enemy at treetop height, wary of man-portable air defense weapons. High above them, though, the Air Force had finally brought out the big guns, the B-52 strategic bombers. These lumbering arsenal ships had taken longer to get to the fight than the much nimbler strike aircraft, but they disgorged earth-shattering amounts of firepower on the enemy below. The enemy artillery and mortar positions were of highest priority as they were preventing the QRF from reaching the beleaguered Rangers and Delta Force operatives. With the artillery destroyed, the QRF finally made it to the besieged American defenders, providing some much-needed relief, even if they were still woefully outnumbered. U.S. planes low on fuel or out of ordnance had by now been forced to turn back, opening up a brief window for the Wagner-led attack. Many of the enemy had abandoned their vehicles by now more a liability than a protection, and advanced on foot. The newly arrived Marines fed fresh ammo to the defenders who by now were nearly out of everything, down to just a few magazines of rifle ammunition. Machine guns and javelins opened up once more, unleashing hell on the advancing troops. From inside their striker vehicles, Marines operated the remote weapon stations, their thermal sensors making it impossible for the enemy to hide in the dark. An AC-130 gunship arrived in the sky overhead, opening up with its howitzer and cannons. Air Force combat controllers began to direct the next wave of American strike aircraft, which had been quickly refueled and rearmed, their weary pilots refusing to be replaced as long as U.S. troops were still under fire. Everything American that could fly in the region was put into the air, the defenders still being massively outnumbered and overmatched in firepower. Every single flight of strike aircraft and attack helicopter was like a flight of guardian angels, delivering righteous fury in the form of precision high explosives and armor-piercing cannon fire. An hour later, the ill-fated attack finally halted. Enemy troops began a hasty withdrawal. In a show of good faith, the U.S. Air Force ceased atomizing the retreating troops. Some were allowed to return to collect their dead. The 500-strong force had been shattered, and the only casualty on the U.S. side was an allied Syrian fighter who had been lightly wounded. So, what really happened and who was in charge, and how was Russia responsible for this overwhelming U.S. victory? Even years after the incident, there remained significant gaps in the public knowledge over the event. Russia denied all responsibility, claimed that no Wagner forces had been involved in or had knowledge of the attack. This was in direct opposition to released U.S. surveillance footage which showed an airstrike on a Wagner artillery position directly supporting the attack. In the months to come, independent journalists inside Russia confirmed that an unusually high number of dead Wagner troops arrived in Russia after the battle. These journalists also confirmed a large number of Wagner mercenaries flown to Russian hospitals in the days after the battle. However, officially the Russian government stated that only 4 Russian volunteers had died in the attack, though later the Syrian and Russian government would say that it's possible dozens were killed or injured. German publication Der Spiegel would conduct an investigation and allege that no Russians were involved in the fighting. Other sources inside Russia made incredible claims of 200 Wagnerites being killed. A Russian investigative group, Conflict Intelligence Team, would do its own investigation and estimate that as many as 30 Russians died in the fighting. In 2023, The Gray Zone, a Telegram channel often associated with Wagner, published a summary of the infamous battle. From interviews with Wagner soldiers present, U.S. forces first used Reaper drones to take out the lead and rear vehicles of the formation in a classic ambush. Then Apache helicopters came roaring into the confused mess, decimating anyone attempting to retreat. A loitering AC-130 gunship pounded defensive positions into dust even as men attempted to find cover in nearby buildings. F-16s hounded them from above, with one Wagnerite allegedly claiming that in the morning the area was littered with liquefied gun barrels and solidified sand, melted in the intense heat of the American attack and re-solidifying after. The Gray Zone would publish accounts from Wagnerites who rallied against the Russian Air Force, which had jets stationed nearby but did not move to aid them. Allegedly, some pilots asked for permission to respond but were refused. With loitering F-22s and F-15s, it was definitely the right call. The Gray Zone would also claim that Wagner casualties were very high, but far less than the 600 or 200 that other outlets were reporting. We'll probably never know how many Wagnerites or even Russian special forces were directly involved in the fighting, but it's clear that the attack was led by Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin, who wanted to seize the Conoco oil field at all costs. However, in a surprising twist, and perhaps one that cemented in Prigozhin's mind the fact that he could no longer trust Putin's government, it was the Russian military itself which ensured the attack would ultimately fail. Russian air defenses were dense in the region and posed a significant challenge for U.S. aircraft. In the years since, the world would learn that despite Russia refusing to recall the attack, they had ordered their air defenses to stand down, giving the green light to the U.S. to use its air power freely. Why this is remains unknown. Perhaps Russia wished to continue its guise of plausible deniability. Wagner is a Russian PMC that works directly in the interest of the Russian government, but as a PMC, it affords Russia the option to disown or disenfranchise itself from any of the group's actions. Turning off the air defenses might have been Russia playing to this plausible deniability. After all, keeping the air defenses on would have essentially married the Russian government to the attack on the Conoco oil field. That would have come with significant consequences, inevitably sparking a significant buildup of U.S. forces in the region and dramatically escalating the possibility of all-out conflict between the two sides. It's also possible that Russia simply significantly underestimated U.S. air power. Air operations are difficult, a carefully choreographed dance of logistics, platforms, and personnel. As the Ukraine war has proven, Russia itself is incapable of coordinating significant air operations, let alone a massive and rapid, extremely time-sensitive response. The Russians might have assumed the U.S. shared this weakness, or that it simply couldn't coordinate so many different platforms so quickly. The Russians bet wrong. The U.S. air operation in the Battle of Kasham is nothing short of a military miracle. No matter which way you stack it, even with significant air support, U.S. forces should have been easily overrun. But the U.S. absolutely annihilates its own budget to find extremely terrifying capabilities you literally never want to be on the wrong end of. Firstly, the U.S. air fleet has the largest capability for close air support of any air fleet in the world. While Russian aerospace forces struggle to deliver accurate ground support, there's hardly any U.S. air combat platform that is incapable of doing the job that Russian planes simply aren't equipped for, and their pilots aren't trained for. The ability for U.S. warplanes from an F-15 to a B-52 to deliver precision ground fire is unmatched by any other nation in the world, and it's basically illegal for any U.S. aircraft of any kind to take to the skies without the ability to drop a bomb with high precision right where the troops need it the most. But U.S. logistics and command and control is the secret hero of the show here, because Russia likely did not expect such a massive and well-coordinated response of so many different air platforms. The U.S. threw literally everything, including the kitchen sink, into the sky that day, knowing that its ground forces were hopelessly outmatched. But such massive air operations require significant command and control expertise and resources, especially to deconflict targets, ensuring that one attack wave isn't simply hitting the exact same already destroyed targets that the last wave did. This is a significant problem for Russian aerospace forces in Ukraine. Russia's problems don't just end there, because the nation is incapable of deconflicting its airspace as well. Hilariously, Russian air defenses in Ukraine are in an intense race with Ukrainian air defenses for the highest number of downed Russian aircraft. That's because Russia lacks the expertise and systems to effectively manage large air operations alongside ground air defenses. It's unlikely then that Russia could have foreseen the expert ballet of command and control that saw U.S. air power hammer attacking forces nearly non-stop for 5 hours. The Battle of Kasham was, well, embarrassing for the Syrian government and for Wagner. But it was also a warning to the rest of the world. If you pick a fight with the US, you absolutely, positively, definitely cannot allow US air power to enter the picture. Now go check out Wagner Group is becoming a big problem for Russia, or click this other video instead.